How can something stand before the world for centuries and still refuse to surrender its meaning? Towering stone complexes, impossible craftsmanship, and puzzling records continue to challenge the sharpest minds, raising questions that grow more compelling with every new discovery. Somewhere within these remarkable traces lies a story still waiting to be understood. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into 3 hours of history's most astonishing mysteries. High in the northern stretch of the Ural Mountains, where pine forests give way to wind-scoured slopes and temperatures drop far beyond what the human body can easily endure, lies a pass that has become synonymous with unanswered questions. Today it is known as Dyatlov Pass, named after Igor Dyatlov, the young leader of a group of 9 experienced hikers who set out in January 1959, never to return alive. The expedition was not casual. These were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, individuals trained in survival techniques, navigation, and winter trekking. Their destination was Otorten Mountain, a route considered challenging but not extraordinary for their level of expertise. Yet something interrupted their journey in a way that still resists complete explanation. When search teams began looking for them weeks later, the first signs seemed confusing rather than revealing. Their abandoned tent was discovered on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, a name often translated as Dead Mountain. It was partially collapsed under snow, but what struck investigators immediately was its condition from within. The fabric had been cut open from the inside, not torn by wind or pressure from outside, but deliberately slit, as if those inside had urgently chosen escape over shelter, stepping directly into freezing darkness without returning for proper gear. Footprints led away from the tent, fading gradually into deep snow. Some were barefoot, others in socks, and a few showed traces of partial footwear. The trail descended toward a nearby forest edge, where the terrain offered slightly more protection from the relentless wind. It was here that the first bodies were found, scattered beneath a cedar tree. The scene suggested a desperate attempt to maintain warmth, branches broken high above the ground, as if someone had climbed in search of shelter or visibility. The official Soviet investigation concluded that the group had died due to a compelling natural force. However, that phrase only deepened the uncertainty. What kind of force could drive experienced hikers to abandon a secure tent in sub-zero conditions, cut it open from the inside, and flee into one of the harshest environments imaginable? As more bodies were recovered, the complexity of the situation increased. Some victims showed signs of severe internal trauma, crushed ribs and skull injuries comparable to a high-impact vehicle accident, yet without external wounds or signs of struggle. One individual was found missing their tongue, and another had eye tissue damage. Yet there was no clear evidence of an external attacker, nor footprints suggesting the presence of other groups. Official explanations shifted over time. One theory proposed a sudden avalanche, though later assessments questioned whether the slope conditions matched typical avalanche behavior. The terrain did not fully support such a collapse, and the arrangement of the tent and footprints seemed inconsistent with a chaotic snowslide. Another possibility considered atmospheric phenomena, including infrasound, low-frequency vibrations generated by wind passing over the mountain terrain. Some researchers suggest such vibrations might induce intense fear, disorientation, or panic responses in humans, potentially explaining the sudden evacuation from the tent. Military involvement has also been speculated upon. At the time, the region was known for restricted zones and testing activities. Witnesses in nearby areas later reported glowing orange spheres moving across the night sky around the time of the incident. These accounts fueled theories involving missile tests or aerial explosions, though no definitive archival evidence has confirmed such operations in that exact location and time frame. Other interpretations move further into the uncertain margins of possibility. Rare weather phenomena, localized seismic activity, or interactions between multiple environmental factors that created a chain reaction of confusion and injury. Yet none of these frameworks fully accounts for every detail recorded at the site. Even the timeline resists clarity. The hikers left behind diaries and photographs documenting earlier stages of their journey. Their final entries show no immediate signs of panic. The transition from routine expedition to fatal disarray remains abrupt, almost without narrative warning. What happened in those final hours on the slope of Kholat Syakhl? Was it a single overwhelming event, or a sequence of smaller disturbances that escalated beyond control in the cold darkness? And why do certain details still refuse to align neatly, even after decades of analysis and re-examination? The mountain remains silent, offering only traces of what once occurred there, as if the landscape itself chose not to reveal the full account. The silence of the Ural slopes does not end the story, it only deepens it. Because thousands of kilometers away, in the remote wilderness of central Siberia, another event unfolded that continues to echo through scientific archives and unanswered testimony. A place where the forest itself once bent to something unseen. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River in what is now Krasnoyarsk Krai, Russia, the sky over the taiga split open with an extraordinary flash of light. Witnesses described a blazing object streaking across the horizon, followed by a forceful shockwave that flattened the landscape in seconds. Trees were not simply knocked down, they were arranged in radial patterns, all pointing outward from a central point, as if pressed by an invisible hand. The explosion, estimated at around 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, leveled more than 2,000 square kilometers of forest. Yet when early scientific expeditions finally reached the site years later, something immediately stood out. There was no impact crater, no metallic fragment, no clear physical remnant of the object that had triggered such overwhelming destruction. This absence became the foundation of a mystery that has never fully settled. Initial Soviet investigations in the early 20th century considered the possibility of a meteor airburst. The most widely accepted explanation today suggests that a small asteroid or comet entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded several kilometers above the surface due to intense pressure and heat. This would account for the shockwave, the flattened forest, and the lack of a crater. But even within this framework, questions remain. Why was the energy distribution so unusual compared to other known atmospheric explosions? Why did certain trees remain standing near the epicenter, stripped of branches but rooted in place like silent witnesses to a directed force? And why did seismographs around the world detect atmospheric disturbances so far from the event itself? Eyewitness accounts collected from indigenous Evenki communities and nearby settlers add further layers. Some described a column of fire moving across the sky, while others spoke of a second light after the main blast, lingering in the atmosphere like a suspended glow. These descriptions, while difficult to verify scientifically, continue to shape the narrative around Tunguska's final moments. Over time, alternative theories have emerged to fill the gaps left by the official interpretation. Some researchers have proposed that the event may have involved a fragment of antimatter, annihilating upon contact with the atmosphere and leaving no trace of material debris. Others have suggested a natural gas explosion rising from deep geological structures beneath the region, igniting violently in the air. There are also more speculative interpretations that move beyond conventional geology or astronomy. One idea considers the possibility of a low-density comet composed primarily of ice and volatile gases, disintegrating completely before reaching the ground. Another explores whether the object's trajectory and energy profile could point toward an unknown class of celestial body, not yet fully categorized by modern science. Even more unconventional hypotheses have been proposed in fringe circles, ranging from experimental energy discharge events to interactions with unknown atmospheric phenomena. While these ideas remain outside mainstream acceptance, they persist as part of the broader attempt to explain why such a powerful explosion left so little physical evidence behind. Modern satellite imaging and forest regrowth studies have allowed scientists to reconstruct aspects of the blast pattern in greater detail. Yet reconstruction is not explanation. The geometry of destruction can be mapped, but the initiating cause still resists full certainty. And so Tunguska remains suspended between clarity and absence, a moment recorded only in its aftermath, where the sky's violence has already passed, leaving the Earth reshaped but not fully understood. Was it simply an unusual cosmic event, rare but natural in origin? Or does the missing crater hint at processes not yet fully recognized within our current scientific framework? More than a century later, the forest has grown back, but the question remains fixed above it. What exactly broke the silence of Siberia that morning in 1908? And why does its full explanation still feel just out of reach? The Tunguska Sky event left behind a question written in flattened forests and absent fragments, an impact without a clear object. Yet the mystery does not remain confined to Siberia. It echoes outward, across oceans and shipping routes where other unexplained disappearances have been recorded. Among them, one case drifts to the surface again and again in maritime accounts: the SS Ourang Medan. The story begins in the waters of the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest and most strategically significant sea passages in Southeast Asia. Somewhere between the islands and shifting currents of this narrow channel, a distress signal is said to have been received in the late 1940s. The transmission was fragmented, reportedly sent in Morse code, and it carried a chilling message repeated across different interpretations: that the crew was dead or dying. The vessel identified in the message was the SS Ourang Medan, a merchant ship whose existence itself remains difficult to confirm in official registries. According to the account that spread through maritime circles, nearby ships eventually traced the signal to a drifting freighter. When they approached, there was no visible damage to the hull, no signs of collision, no storm debris, only a ship floating unnaturally still on calm water. Boarding parties that reportedly stepped aboard encountered an unsettling silence. The crew, from the captain to the lowest ranks, were found lifeless in various positions across the ship. Some accounts describe bodies lying on their backs with eyes wide open, faces fixed in expressions of shock. Others mention unusual postures, as if the final moments had been marked by sudden collective alarm. Yet what caused that moment? And why did it appear to affect everyone aboard at once? Before any investigation could fully begin, the narrative takes a strange turn. According to the most widely circulated version of events, the ship began to show signs of fire in its lower compartments. Fearing a possible explosion, rescuers abandoned the vessel. Shortly after, the SS Ourang Medan is said to have been engulfed in flames and then sank beneath the surface, taking with it the opportunity for direct examination. This sudden disappearance of physical evidence is part of what keeps the story suspended between history and uncertainty. Skeptics have long pointed out that there is no definitive shipping record confirming the vessel's existence in Lloyd's Register or other comprehensive maritime archives of the period. Some suggest the entire account may have originated from misreported incidents in Southeast Asian waters, later amplified through secondary retellings in newspapers and naval reports. In this interpretation, the Ourang Medan becomes less a single ship and more a convergence of fragmented maritime tragedies. Yet alternative perspectives continue to circulate. One theory considers the possibility of hazardous cargo aboard an unnamed vessel, perhaps chemicals, industrial gases, or other volatile materials capable of causing rapid, silent fatalities. In this view, the crew's condition might be explained by exposure to toxic substances, with fire breaking out afterward due to unstable compounds in the hold. Another interpretation explores navigational or atmospheric anomalies. Could a sudden release of gas from the seafloor or an unusual environmental event have created conditions lethal enough to incapacitate an entire crew without visible external damage to the ship? Such ideas remain speculative, but they persist in discussions of unexplained maritime incidents. More unconventional theories extend further into the unknown, suggesting electromagnetic disturbances, experimental wartime technologies, or even psychological mass panic triggered by unseen environmental factors. None of these explanations have been verified, yet each attempts to account for the same core anomaly: a ship found intact, yet emptied of life without clear cause. Even today, the lead mask's case resists final classification. It sits between laboratory and uncertainty, between documentation and silence, where evidence suggests direction, but never certainty. And so the question lingers in that quiet room on the hillside. What kind of knowledge were they reaching for in those final hours, and why does the answer still feel just out of reach? From the drifting silence of the Ourang Medan, where uncertainty clung to every unanswered distress call, the investigation of maritime mysteries gives way to something equally perplexing on land, where the final moments of ordinary individuals were recorded in the most unexpected and unsettling circumstances. In the hills above Niterói, Brazil, another case waits, preserved not in water or wind, but in a quiet room sealed against time. On February 20th, 1966, rescue teams were called to a modest hillside residence overlooking Guanabara Bay. Inside, they discovered the bodies of two men lying side by side on the floor of a sparsely furnished room. The location was unremarkable at first glance. Simple furniture, minimal disturbance, no immediate signs of struggle or forced entry. Yet the scene itself carried a stillness that felt unusually deliberate, as if the final moments had unfolded in careful sequence rather than chaos. The victims were identified as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana, both electronics technicians. According to accounts from friends and family, the two men had left home 2 days earlier, reportedly on a mission connected to their technical work. They were said to be pursuing instructions linked to experimental electronics or scientific experimentation, though the exact purpose of their outing remains unclear. When investigators examined the room, they found one of the most distinctive and puzzling elements of the case. Both men were wearing improvised lead eye masks. These were not refined medical devices, but crude coverings constructed from metal sheets shaped over the eye region, resembling protective shields. Nearby, a small notebook contained fragmented instructions and mathematical notes, along with references that have been interpreted in multiple ways over the years. Among the most frequently cited details are phrases suggesting timing and procedure, references to specific hours and actions to be taken while waiting for the signal. Yet the meaning of these notes remains ambiguous. Were they instructions for a scientific experiment, an attempt at electrical or atmospheric testing, or something more experimental in nature? Or were they misinterpreted fragments of an entirely different purpose? No signs of violence were found on the bodies. There were no indications of forced entry, no struggle, and no clear evidence pointing to external involvement. The cause of death was never conclusively determined at the scene. Autopsy reports, while limited in scope, did not immediately reveal a definitive cause, such as poisoning or trauma. This absence of clarity became the foundation for decades of speculation. One of the earliest mainstream interpretations suggested accidental poisoning, possibly from inhalation of toxic substances related to experimental materials or improperly handled chemicals. Given their background in electronics, some investigators considered whether the men might have been working with components that released harmful gases under certain conditions. Another line of thought focused on the lead masks themselves. Were they intended to protect against radiation, electrical discharge, or some form of experimental exposure? If so, what kind of experiment would require such unconventional protective equipment in a private residence, without formal laboratory conditions? Over time, more speculative interpretations emerged. Some accounts suggested involvement with early forms of radio signal experimentation, perhaps attempting to receive or interpret transmissions under controlled sensory conditions. Others proposed that the men were influenced by esoteric or fringe scientific ideas circulating at the time, blending technical curiosity with unconventional theories about energy, frequency, or perception. There are also interpretations that move further away from established scientific frameworks. Some suggest the possibility of psychological conditioning or ritualistic behavior tied to belief systems involving precise timing and symbolic actions. Others point toward miscommunication, an experiment that was far simpler in intention than it appears in retrospect, but whose outcome became tragic due to unforeseen variables. Yet despite these interpretations, the central enigma remains intact. Why did two trained technicians, with apparent preparation and intention, end their final moments in such a carefully arranged and unexplained scenario? And why were the instructions they left behind so open to multiple conflicting readings? What makes the Ourang Medan particularly enduring is not only what is claimed to have happened, but what cannot be independently confirmed. There is no wreckage to examine, no definitive crew list, no final preserved report that resolves the contradictions. Only overlapping accounts, each carrying fragments of a larger, unresolved picture. And so the question remains, drifting like the vessel itself once did in open water, what could bring an entire ship to silence without leaving a clear trace of the force behind it? From the stillness of the Niederoy hillside and the unanswered questions left in that sealed room, the narrative shifts once more, this time away from laboratories and coastal silence, toward a remote stretch of Bavarian farmland where isolation itself seemed to shape the atmosphere. In the winter of 1922, near the small hamlet of Grobern in Germany, a place known as Hinterkaifeck became the center of one of the most perplexing and disturbing unsolved cases in European criminal history. Hinterkaifeck was not a village, but a solitary farmstead positioned roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich. Surrounded by fields and dense woodland, it stood apart from neighboring homes, accessible only by a narrow path. In the days leading up to the event, unusual signs were reportedly noticed by those living there, footprints in the snow that appeared to approach the farm from the forest, yet showed no clear return path. Strange noises were said to come from the attic, and tools reportedly went missing, only to reappear later in unexpected places. These details, recorded in witness accounts and later investigations, created an atmosphere of growing unease. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the Gruber family, farm owner Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's two children, along with the newly arrived maid, were all killed inside the property. The brutality of the crime was extreme, and yet the scene offered few immediate answers. What made the case particularly haunting was not only the violence itself, but the apparent sequence of events leading up to it. In the days that followed, neighbors noticed something unusual. The farm's smoke continued to rise from the chimney, suggesting someone remained on the property. Livestock were still being fed. The household appeared, at least from a distance, to be functioning normally, despite the absence of communication from those inside. It was only when concern grew that local residents entered the property and discovered the bodies in the barn. Investigators from the Munich police arrived shortly after. The layout of the scene suggested that each victim had been drawn individually into different areas of the farm before being attacked. This detail raised immediate questions. Had the perpetrator been living inside the house before the murders? Or had they remained hidden nearby, observing the family over several days? During the investigation, several unsettling details emerged. tools, and food supplies appeared to have been used by someone after the time the victims were believed to have died. Animals were cared for. The home did not show signs of a quick escape or immediate abandonment by an outsider. These observations led some investigators to consider whether the perpetrator might have remained on the property for a period of time after the crime, or even before it, undetected. Suspicions eventually turned toward individuals within the surrounding community. Various theories emerged, including disputes over inheritance, personal conflicts, and strained relationships involving members of the Gruber household. One line of inquiry also examined Andreas Gruber's reported claims prior to the incident that he had discovered footprints in the snow leading toward the farm, but not away from it, suggesting, in his interpretation, that someone may have been secretly approaching the property. Over time, other interpretations surfaced. Some suggested the involvement of a drifter or individual familiar with rural farm layouts, capable of moving between buildings without detection. Others speculated about psychological motivations rooted in long-standing interpersonal tensions, possibly escalating over years of isolation and unresolved conflict. More speculative ideas have also circulated, including the possibility of a perpetrator who observed the family's routines closely enough to manipulate timing and movement within the household. In this view, the farm becomes less a random target and more a controlled environment, where every action was anticipated and influenced from within or nearby. Yet despite extensive investigation, no definitive perpetrator was ever confirmed. The case file grew, theories multiplied, but certainty never emerged. Even the physical site itself was eventually demolished in the 1920s, leaving no structure behind to revisit or re-examine with modern methods. What remains is a pattern of observation without resolution. Footprints that led in, but not out. A household that continued its routines after silence had already fallen, and a crime scene that seems to suggest knowledge of the space that only someone intimately familiar with it could possess. And so Hinterkaifeck lingers not as a closed chapter, but as an open question etched into rural memory. What truly happened inside that isolated farmstead, and why does the full sequence of events still resist a single, complete explanation? From the quiet isolation of Hinterkaifeck, where rural silence once concealed unanswered violence, the narrative shifts again, this time to a shoreline where the land itself seems to end in uncertainty. Along the warm curve of Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia, another case emerged that would leave behind no clear identity, no confirmed origin, and no final explanation. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, passers-by noticed a man lying on the sand, positioned upright against the seawall as if he had chosen a place of rest rather than collapse. He was well dressed in a suit and polished shoes, an unusual detail for a beach setting at dawn. There were no visible signs of struggle, no immediate indication of violence, and no identification on his person. The location appeared calm, almost ordinary, waves rolling in softly, the early light stretching across the shoreline. Yet the stillness of the scene contrasted sharply with the questions it would soon generate. When authorities examined the body, they found that all labels had been removed from his clothing. His pockets contained no wallet, no passport, no clear trace of identity. A comb, chewing gum, a packet of cigarettes, and a bus ticket were among the few remaining items. Everything suggested careful removal of personal markers, as if someone had intentionally erased the possibility of recognition. The most puzzling discovery came later, when a small scrap of paper was found hidden in a concealed pocket sewn into his trousers. On it were the words, "Tamam Shud," a phrase meaning ended or finished, taken from the final page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of Persian poetry translated into English and widely circulated in the early 20th century. The discovery of this fragment immediately deepened the mystery. The torn page was traced back to a rare edition of the book, and shortly after, a copy matching the source was reportedly located. Inside that book, investigators found handwritten notes, seemingly a code or series of letters and symbols that defied immediate interpretation. Alongside them was a telephone number, which led authorities to a local woman who claimed no knowledge of the deceased man. The connection between the book, the coded markings, and the unidentified body has never been fully clarified. Was this a personal message, a discarded record of private communication, or something more structured, perhaps an encrypted set of instructions? Medical examinations revealed further ambiguity. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, though some reports suggested signs consistent with poisoning. However, no definitive toxin was confirmed at the time, and later analyses have continued to yield inconclusive results. The absence of clear evidence left room for multiple interpretations, none of which fully resolved the sequence of events leading to his death on the beach. Over time, several mainstream theories emerged. One suggested the man might have been involved in intelligence work, possibly during a period when Cold War tensions were beginning to reshape global surveillance and secrecy. The removal of identification, the coded note, and the obscure book reference have all been interpreted within this framework, though no official record has ever confirmed such an affiliation. Another explanation considers the possibility of a personal tragedy, an individual deliberately erasing their identity before ending their life, leaving behind fragments of meaning drawn from literature rather than direct explanation. In this view, the cryptic note becomes less a code and more a symbolic gesture, its interpretation shaped by those who discovered it rather than its original intent. There are also more speculative interpretations. Some suggest involvement in clandestine networks, where coded literature and anonymous identities were used as a form of communication. Others propose misdirection, an intentionally constructed mystery designed to obscure a more ordinary reality that was never recovered or documented. Yet despite decades of analysis, forensic review, and renewed attention, the identity of the man found at Somerton Beach has never been confirmed. The words Taman Shud remain as they were found, final, absolute, and yet unresolved in meaning. And so the case rests at the edge of understanding, where identity dissolves into fragments of paper, numbers, and silence. Who was the man on Somerton Beach, and what story ended with those two words, before anyone could learn his name? From the unidentified man on Somerton Beach, whose identity dissolved into fragments of poetry and code, the search for meaning moves once more toward isolation. This time not on a shoreline, but on a cluster of barren rocks in the North Atlantic, where land gives way to endless sea and weather shapes every detail of human presence. Here, on the Flannan Isles, silence itself became the most unsettling discovery. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse stands on Eilean Moor, one of a small group of remote islands off the west coast of Scotland. Built to guide ships through the treacherous waters of the Outer Hebrides, it was completed in the early 20th century, its white tower rising against a landscape defined by wind, salt, and relentless ocean currents. In December 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers were stationed there: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Their task was routine but vital: maintain the light, record the weather, and ensure safe passage for passing vessels. For weeks, everything appeared normal. The lighthouse kept its rhythm, its beam cutting through darkness as expected. Then, unexpectedly, that rhythm stopped. When a passing ship attempted to signal the lighthouse in mid-December, there was no response. The light was not visible. Concern grew slowly at first, as weather conditions in the region were often severe enough to delay communication or limit visibility. But when relief keeper Joseph Moore arrived on December 26th, what he found would turn routine isolation into one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries. The lighthouse was intact. Doors were closed. Lamps had been refilled. Beds appeared unmade, as if recently used, yet abandoned without warning. A meal had been prepared but left uneaten. 2 of the men's oilskins were missing, while the third remained inside. The logbook, carefully maintained until December 15th, recorded increasingly severe weather conditions in the days leading up to the disappearance. The final entries described powerful storms sweeping the islands, winds so strong they were said to exceed anything the keepers had experienced. Yet meteorological records from nearby stations have not fully confirmed the extreme conditions described in the log. This discrepancy has become one of the first points of uncertainty in the case. Most official interpretations suggest that one of the keepers may have gone outside during a storm to secure equipment or investigate damage along the cliffs. In this scenario, a chain reaction could have followed, another keeper leaving to assist, and a third following in turn, resulting in all 3 being swept away by the sea or falling from the rocky terrain. The absence of bodies has been attributed to the powerful currents surrounding the islands. Yet even within this explanation, questions remain. Why were the oilskins taken from inside the lighthouse when at least one remained unused? Why was the table set, the meal prepared, and then abandoned so abruptly? And why was the interior of the lighthouse left in such an orderly condition if an emergency had unfolded outside? Alternative interpretations have emerged over time, shaped by the isolation of the location and the psychological pressures associated with lighthouse duty. Some suggest that one keeper may have experienced a sudden crisis, physical or mental, prompting the others to respond in haste. Others consider whether miscommunication during extreme weather could have led to a series of misjudged decisions, each one escalating beyond recovery. There are also more speculative ideas that drift further from conventional explanations. Some accounts speak of unusual atmospheric conditions affecting perception in isolated environments, where sound, light, and distance can behave unpredictably. Others explore the possibility of external maritime involvement, though no confirmed evidence of passing vessels or distress signals supports this line of thought. And yet, perhaps what makes the Flannan Isles case so persistent is not what is known, but what is absent. There is no struggle recorded in detail, no definitive trace of the men's final movements beyond the lighthouse threshold, and no physical resolution to the sequence of events described in the logbook. The sea around Eilean Moor remains vast and indifferent, erasing footprints and absorbing sound before it can become testimony. The lighthouse still stands, rebuilt and automated long after human keepers departed, its light now mechanical and uninterrupted. But the question lingers in the wind that continues to strike its walls. What truly caused 3 experienced keepers to leave a place of safety in such a final, unreturned moment, and what part of their last hours still lies beyond the reach of recorded history? From the wind-beaten isolation of the Flannan Isles, where 3 men vanished without a trace from a lighthouse that still stood untouched, the narrative shifts again, this time across the Atlantic, into the wooded highlands of southern Vermont. Here, the landscape changes character with the seasons, but the sense of quiet uncertainty remains constant. Locals call it a place where the forest feels too dense, the valleys too still, as if something within them occasionally interrupts the expected order of things. This region is often referred to as the Bennington Triangle, a loosely defined area surrounding Glastonbury Mountain and parts of southwestern Vermont. Unlike official geographic boundaries, this triangle exists more as a pattern observed through a series of unexplained disappearances that took place between the late 1940s and early 1950s. The terrain itself is rugged and heavily wooded, with old logging roads, abandoned settlements, and steep ridgelines that shift rapidly into deep forest. One of the earliest and most discussed cases involves Mitty Rivers, a seasoned hunting guide who disappeared in November 1945 while leading a group in the area. He was familiar with the land, experienced in tracking and navigation, yet one moment he was ahead of his group on a known trail, and the next, he was gone. No definitive trace of him was ever found, despite extensive searches. Just a few years later, in 1946, Paula Weldon, a college student from nearby Bennington, set out alone for a hike along the long trail. Witnesses reported seeing her on the path heading toward Glastonbury Mountain. She never returned. Search teams combed the forest for weeks, but the dense terrain and shifting weather patterns offered little clarity. No belongings, no clear trail, no final indication of direction. Then came the case of Paul Jepson in 1950, an 8-year-old boy who disappeared from a farm truck while his mother was briefly occupied nearby. Despite immediate searches, including efforts involving search dogs, no reliable trace of the child was ever recovered. Each case, separated by years, seemed unrelated on the surface, yet collectively they formed a pattern of absence centered on the same geographical area. And finally, in 1951, an experienced outdoorsman named James Tedford vanished under equally perplexing circumstances. According to accounts, he was seen boarding a bus traveling through the region. When the bus reached its destination, Tedford was no longer aboard. His belongings reportedly remained on the seat, as if he had simply stepped out mid-journey without anyone noticing. Official explanations for these disappearances vary. Some point to the harsh and unpredictable terrain, thick forest cover, rapidly changing weather, and areas where trails fade without warning. In such environments, even experienced individuals can lose orientation, and search efforts can be hampered by visibility and accessibility. The idea of accidental death, followed by the forest reclaiming any physical evidence, remains one of the more grounded interpretations. Others have considered the possibility of more localized factors, wildlife encounters, misadventure, or environmental conditions that create sudden disorientation. The region's geology and magnetic variations have also been examined, though no consistent anomaly has been confirmed that could account for multiple disappearances across different years and circumstances. Yet alternative interpretations continue to circulate. Some suggest the possibility of unusual atmospheric or psychological effects in isolated forested regions, where extended exposure to silence and dense natural surroundings might influence perception or decision-making in ways not fully understood. Others explore folkloric accounts tied to the region's older history, where stories of shifting paths and disorienting landscapes have existed long before modern records. There are also more speculative ideas that move beyond conventional explanation, suggestions of rare natural phenomena or unknown environmental interactions that temporarily alter navigation or awareness. While these remain outside verified science, they persist in discussions surrounding the Bennington Triangle as attempts to bridge the gap between pattern and absence. What makes these cases particularly enduring is not only the disappearances themselves, but the consistency of uncertainty surrounding them. Each individual was known, each moment before their disappearance partially documented, yet none provide a clear transition from presence to absence. The forest does not seem to offer resistance, nor does it reveal answers. It simply remains, absorbing every search, every theory, every return visit without resolution. And so the Bennington Triangle stands not as a defined boundary on a map, but as a lingering question within a landscape of trees and silence. What is it about this stretch of wilderness that allows people to vanish so completely? And why does the line between explanation and uncertainty still feel so thin here? From the quiet woods of Vermont, where trails seem to dissolve into silence and entire lives have vanished without trace, the narrative turns once more toward a place defined not by wilderness alone, but by firelight, family, and the fragile certainty of home. In the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, Christmas Eve of 1945 carried the warmth of routine, until it did not. The Sodder family home stood along the hillsides overlooking the town, a modest house filled with children, laughter, and the familiar rhythms of daily life. George and Jenny Sodder lived there with their large family of 10 children, creating a household that, by all accounts, was lively and closely bonded. On the night of December 24th, as Christmas preparations unfolded inside, the atmosphere was ordinary, until a sequence of unusual events began to interrupt it. Earlier that evening, strange occurrences were reported around the property. One witness later claimed to have seen a peculiar vehicle parked near the road, with unfamiliar men observing the house. Another account described a phone call that ended abruptly after a woman's voice reportedly laughed and then hung up without explanation. These details, though never conclusively verified, became part of the growing unease surrounding the night. Later, a fire broke out in the Sodder home. Flames spread rapidly, consuming the structure while George and Jenny managed to escape along with 4 of their children. The remaining 5, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were believed to be inside. Firefighters attempted to respond, but critical delays occurred. Equipment malfunctioned, and water access was reportedly limited, leaving the fire to burn unchecked for hours. When the ruins were eventually examined, what followed became the foundation of decades of uncertainty. No remains of the 5 missing children were conclusively identified in the ashes. This absence immediately raised questions, as even in severe fires, some physical traces are typically expected. Authorities at the time suggested that the fire's intensity could have accounted for the lack of recoverable evidence, though this explanation did not fully resolve the concerns of the family. George and Jenny Sodder, unable to accept the conclusion that their children had perished in the fire, began to investigate independently. Their efforts uncovered inconsistencies in witness statements, delays in emergency response, and conflicting accounts of what was seen and heard that night. Over time, the Sodders came to believe that the fire may not have been an accident, but something more deliberate in nature. One of the most persistent elements of the case involves the possibility that the children survived the fire. In the weeks and years following the incident, Jenny Sodder reportedly received accounts from individuals claiming to have seen children matching their descriptions. One photograph, sent anonymously, showed young boys in a distant location, leading the family to wonder whether it depicted their missing sons. However, no definitive identification was ever made. Investigators and independent researchers have considered multiple explanations. Some suggest that the fire was accidental, possibly caused by faulty wiring or heating equipment common in rural homes of that era. In this view, the absence of remains is attributed to the intensity and duration of the blaze combined with structural collapse and delayed firefighting response. Others have explored more troubling possibilities. Some accounts point to local tensions involving George Sodder, who had expressed outspoken views on political matters that may have created friction within the community. This has led to speculation, never proven, that the fire may have involved intentional wrongdoing rather than accident. There are also interpretations that move further into uncertainty. Some suggest the children may have been removed from the home prior to or during the fire, though no verified evidence has confirmed such an event. Others propose miscommunication, witness misinterpretation, or fragmented memories shaped by the chaos of the night. Yet despite investigations, inquiries, and decades of reflection, no conclusive explanation has emerged. The physical site of the Sodder home no longer stands as it once did, but the absence at its center remains unchanged. What makes the Sodder case endure is not only the fire itself, but what followed it, the silence where answers should have been, and the space left open by identities never confirmed or recovered. 5 children, once part of a visible, documented family life, seemed to vanish into uncertainty within a single night. And so the question remains, suspended like smoke above the ruins of that Christmas Eve. What truly happened inside the Sodder home, and why does the truth of that night still resist every attempt to be fully known? From the unanswered questions left behind in the Sodder family home, where absence replaced certainty on a winter night, the narrative shifts once more, this time upward into the open skies above southern Australia, where distance is measured not in roads or forests, but in horizon lines that seem to stretch beyond comprehension. It is here, over the Bass Strait, that another disappearance unfolded, not on the ground, but in the air, where communication itself becomes fragile. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, a young pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport in Victoria, Australia. He was flying a Cessna 182L light aircraft, a small single-engine plane commonly used for training and short-distance travel. His intended route was a straightforward coastal flight toward King Island, a journey he had undertaken before. The weather was reported as clear, visibility adequate, and conditions generally suitable for navigation. At first, everything followed expected patterns. Valentich maintained radio contact with Melbourne Air Traffic Control, reporting his position and altitude as he crossed over familiar territory. But as he approached the stretch of water between mainland Australia and Tasmania, the tone of his transmissions began to change. He reported encountering an aircraft flying at a similar altitude. However, he described it in unusual terms. Its structure, its movement, and its behavior did not match known aircraft patterns. According to recorded radio transmissions, Valentich stated that the object was orbiting or circling his plane, moving in ways that appeared deliberate and controlled. Air traffic controllers attempted to clarify what he was observing. They asked for details: the type of aircraft, its lighting, its direction. Valentich's responses became increasingly uncertain. He described the object as having a metallic appearance, with a smooth surface and unusual speed. At one point, he reported engine issues, suggesting interference or mechanical disruption. Then, during the final moments of communication, something shifted. Valentich described the object as hovering above his aircraft. His transmission included a phrase that has since been analyzed, replayed, and dissected countless times. He reported that the object was not an aircraft. Shortly afterward, radio contact abruptly ceased. There was no distress signal, no confirmed transmission after that moment, no radar confirmation of his aircraft's continued flight path. The Cessna and its pilot vanished over open water, leaving behind only fragments of audio and a last recorded position that offered no physical trace. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately. Aircraft and vessels scoured the Bass Strait for debris, oil slicks, or wreckage consistent with a crash. Despite extensive efforts, no confirmed remains of Valentich or his aircraft were ever recovered. The ocean offered no definitive evidence of impact, no scattered fragments that could conclusively explain the disappearance. From an official perspective, several possibilities were considered. One explanation suggests spatial disorientation, a known risk in night flying over water, where pilots can lose visual reference points and misjudge altitude or direction. In such conditions, controlled flight into water without distress communication is a documented aviation risk. Another interpretation considers mechanical failure. A sudden engine malfunction or fuel issue could have led to loss of control, especially in an aircraft of that size. However, this does not fully account for the unusual radio communications prior to disappearance, which remain part of the official record. As the case entered public awareness, additional layers of interpretation began to form. Valentich had expressed interest in aviation phenomena and unidentified aerial sightings prior to the flight. This detail has led some to question whether his perception during the flight was influenced by expectation, misinterpretation, or unfamiliar atmospheric conditions. Yet the recorded transmissions remain difficult to fully categorize. His descriptions of the object's movement, its ability to appear fixed in position while simultaneously circling, do not easily align with conventional aircraft behavior. Radar systems at the time did not confirm the presence of another aircraft in the vicinity, though limitations in coverage over open water have been noted. Over time, alternative theories emerged. Some suggest atmospheric optical effects, such as light reflection or rare cloud formations, which could create illusions of structured movement under certain conditions. Others propose the possibility of secret military testing or experimental aircraft operations not disclosed to civilian aviation authorities at the time. There are also interpretations that move further into speculative territory. Some accounts point toward unknown aerial phenomena, suggesting Valentich may have encountered a natural or artificial object not yet classified within established aviation records. These ideas remain unverified, but they persist in discussions surrounding unexplained aerial disappearances. More symbolic interpretations have also been proposed, suggesting psychological stress, spatial confusion, or even the possibility that Valentich misidentified environmental cues during night flight over featureless water. In this view, the final radio transmissions reflect a mind attempting to interpret unfamiliar stimuli under increasing cognitive strain. And yet, none of these explanations fully account for every element of the case. The radio transcript remains intact, but incomplete. The aircraft left no confirmed wreckage. The sea provided no closure. And the final moments of communication ended without resolution. What makes the disappearance of Frederick Valentich endure is not only the absence of physical evidence, but the presence of a detailed final narrative, one recorded in real time, yet still open to interpretation. A pilot speaking clearly, then uncertainly, then not at all, over a stretch of water that holds no answers of its own. And so the question remains suspended above the Bass Strait, where sky meets sea without landmarks or boundaries. What did Frederick Valentich encounter in those final minutes of flight, and why has the full story of that evening never returned from the silence that followed? From the silence left behind in the skies over Bass Strait, where a pilot's final transmission dissolved into open air without explanation, the narrative returns to solid ground once more, this time to a quiet industrial town in northern Germany, where routine life once surrounded a man whose final hours would become one of the most cryptic sequences in modern investigative history. In Hagen, in the autumn of 1984, an ordinary evening began to unfold in a way that would soon defy ordinary interpretation. The case centers on a man named Gunther Stoll, a food technologist by profession, living a seemingly stable life with no widely documented history of instability or public disturbance. On October 25, 1984, he was at home when something unusual occurred, something he would later refer to only indirectly, in fragments that would be reconstructed after his death. According to later accounts, Stoll had long spoken of a mysterious phrase, YOGTZE. He reportedly believed it carried significance, though its meaning, if any, was never clarified. That night, around 11 p.m., Stoll suddenly wrote the word YOGTZE on a piece of paper. Then, in what investigators would later describe as an abrupt behavioral shift, he crossed out the letters, left his home, and drove into the night. His destination, his intention, and his emotional state remain subjects of interpretation, pieced together from limited witness accounts and investigative reconstruction. Earlier that evening, Stoll had reportedly told his wife about feeling threatened or pursued, though the details of this claim remain inconsistent across later testimonies. He had also mentioned experiencing a sense of unease connected to the word he repeatedly referenced. Yet there was no confirmed evidence of direct confrontation, surveillance, or identifiable external threat at that point in time. After leaving his home, Stoll drove through the region, eventually stopping at a local tavern. Witnesses there later described him as agitated, speaking in fragmented thoughts, though the exact content of his conversations was never fully reconstructed. He left the establishment and continued driving alone into the night. At approximately 3 a.m., his vehicle was discovered off a rural road near the village of Hagen. The car had veered into a ditch, with damage consistent with a collision. Inside, Stoll was found severely injured but still alive, reportedly attempting to communicate in his final moments. According to emergency responders, he made references that were difficult to interpret clearly, suggesting the presence of other individuals or a sense of being pursued. He died shortly after being found, leaving behind a sequence of events that, while partially documented, resisted full explanation. The official investigation considered several possibilities. One interpretation suggests a traffic accident followed by confusion or disorientation in the aftermath. In this view, Stoll may have lost control of his vehicle under unclear circumstances, with subsequent behavior influenced by shock or injury. However, this explanation does not fully account for earlier elements of the case, particularly his abrupt departure from home after writing the word YOGTZE, or his reported emotional state prior to the incident. These details have led investigators to consider psychological stress, paranoia, or an acute episode of mental distress as contributing factors. Yet even within this framework, the origin of the term YOGTZE remains unresolved. No recognized word, acronym, or code corresponding to that exact sequence has been definitively identified in linguistic, scientific, or technical records. Various attempts have been made to interpret it as a miswriting, an abbreviation, or a personal reference, but none have achieved consensus. As the case gained attention over time, alternative interpretations began to emerge. Some researchers have suggested that Stoll may have believed he had uncovered or stumbled upon something significant, whether in a professional context or through personal perception, that he could not fully articulate. In this reading, the word becomes less a code and more a symbolic anchor for an internal experience that was never externally verified. Other interpretations explore the possibility of miscommunication or misinterpretation during the final hours of his life. Witness accounts from the tavern, the timeline of his movements, and his reported statements in the aftermath of the crash do not align perfectly, leaving gaps in the reconstructed narrative. These gaps have allowed for further speculation, though no additional evidence has emerged to close them. More speculative ideas extend further beyond conventional explanation. Some suggest the possibility of Stoll encountering a sequence of events that he misinterpreted under psychological strain, leading to a cascading series of decisions driven by fear or confusion. Others have proposed that the perceived threat he described may have been subjective rather than external, shaped by internal, cognitive, or emotional conditions that intensified over time. There are also interpretations that treat the case as an example of coincidence layered upon coincidence, a chain of ordinary events that, when viewed retrospectively, appears structured despite lacking intentional design. In this view, the apparent mystery is constructed by gaps in documentation rather than the presence of hidden forces. And yet, despite decades of review, the central elements remain unresolved. A man writes an unknown word. He leaves his home abruptly. He travels through the night in a state of visible distress. His final moments suggest urgency, confusion, and an attempt to communicate something that was never fully recorded or understood. The word YOGTZE itself remains unchanged, untranslated, unclassified, and unconfirmed in meaning. It exists only as it was written, detached from context, yet central to everything that followed. And so the case of Gunther Stoll lingers in a space between language and silence, where meaning appears briefly but never fully forms. What was YOGTZE? A warning, a misunderstanding, a private code, or something entirely unconnected to any known system of meaning? And why does the answer still feel absent from the record, even after every attempt to interpret it? From the unresolved final movements of Gunther Stoll, where a single, unexplained word seemed to guide an entire chain of events that ended in silence, the narrative shifts once more, away from isolated roads and fragmented human behavior, toward something far more public, yet equally disorienting. This time, the mystery does not occur in isolation, but inside the very systems designed to transmit clarity. In the structured flow of broadcast television, where signals are meant to be controlled, predictable, and regulated, something unexpected briefly took control. On the evening of November 22, 1987, viewers in Chicago, United States, were watching routine programming on two separate television stations, WGN-TV and later WTTWW. Both were major broadcasters, part of a tightly managed network of licensed transmission systems. In theory, every second of airtime was accounted for. Every signal had a source, every interruption a cause. But that evening, during a late-night sports segment on WGN-TV, something interrupted the expected order. The broadcast suddenly cut to a distorted video signal. The screen filled with flickering static, and then an unfamiliar figure appeared, wearing a mask resembling Max Headroom, a digital character from popular media at the time. The figure moved erratically against a shifting, artificial-looking backdrop, as if the transmission itself was unstable or deliberately manipulated. There was no immediate explanation from the station, no scheduled programming interruption, no emergency broadcast, just a sudden, unauthorized takeover of the signal. Roughly 2 hours later, a second intrusion occurred, this time during a broadcast of a science fiction program on WTTW. Again, the signal was overridden. The same masked figure appeared, this time in a more controlled environment, though still surrounded by distorted audio and visual interference. The broadcast lasted only a few minutes before technicians regained control. What made the intrusion particularly unusual was not only its content, but its apparent sophistication. At the time, television signals were distributed through complex but vulnerable analog infrastructure, often involving microwave relay towers and transmission links. To override a signal required access to broadcasting frequencies and a level of technical coordination that suggested familiarity with the system itself. Yet despite investigations, no official source was ever identified. In the immediate aftermath, engineers and federal communications authorities examined transmission logs, signal paths, and equipment integrity. The conclusion reached was that the intrusion was not the result of an internal system failure. Instead, it appeared to originate externally, though the exact location and method of entry were never conclusively determined. This absence of attribution became the foundation of the mystery. The visual quality of the intrusion suggested that the perpetrators possessed not only technical knowledge, but also an understanding of broadcast timing and signal behavior. The distorted mask, the erratic performance, and the deliberate disruption of programming all indicated a level of preparation that went beyond random interference. But what was the purpose? Mainstream interpretations have considered the possibility of a deliberate act of signal hijacking carried out by individuals with technical expertise, possibly experimenting with broadcast systems. In this view, the intrusion was not necessarily symbolic, but rather an act of unauthorized access, an attempt to demonstrate control over a vulnerable communication infrastructure. Others have suggested that it may have been a form of media protest or performance art, designed to exploit the visibility of television to create confusion and public attention. The use of a known pop culture figure could support the idea of commentary on media saturation, identity, or technological dependence. However, neither explanation fully accounts for the precision of the execution or the fact that two separate stations were affected within a short time frame. As time passed, additional interpretations emerged. Some theorists proposed that the intrusion may have involved coordinated individuals operating across multiple transmission points, using knowledge of microwave relay systems that were less publicly documented at the time. This would imply a level of planning and technical capability that was uncommon outside professional broadcasting environments. Others have considered whether insider involvement could have played a role, someone with access to infrastructure who understood how to bypass standard monitoring systems. yet no individual or group was ever identified, and no credible claim of responsibility was made in the aftermath. There are also more speculative interpretations that frame the event as an early example of experimental digital interference occurring at a transitional moment in communication technology. In this view, the intrusion becomes a signal from a system still in evolution, where the boundaries between control and disruption were not yet fully secured. More abstract theories suggest symbolic intent. The Max Headroom figure, already associated with artificial presentation and media identity, becomes in this reading a distorted reflection of broadcast culture itself, an image of control breaking into fragmentation, appearing briefly before being cut off by the system it disrupted. Yet even these interpretations remain incomplete. What is known is precise. 2 broadcasts were interrupted. A masked figure appeared. Audio and visual distortion followed. And then, control was restored. What remains unknown is equally precise. Who was responsible, how access was achieved, and why no credible source ever came forward. In the years since, transmission systems have evolved, becoming more secure, more digital, more layered with safeguards. Yet the Max Headroom intrusion remains preserved as a rare moment when those systems briefly failed to contain what entered them. And so the question persists within the architecture of modern broadcasting itself. Was this an isolated act of technical intrusion, a coordinated demonstration of hidden capability, or something that revealed just how permeable even the most controlled systems can become when understanding exceeds expectation, and what, if anything, still lies unaccounted for in the spaces between signals? From the fractured silence of broadcast signals in Chicago, where unseen hands briefly bent the rules of transmission, the narrative shifts once more, away from modern technology and into a colder, quieter landscape shaped not by human systems, but by nature itself. Here, in the rural counties of Devon, England, the ground becomes a record. And in February of 1855, that record appeared to change overnight in a way no one could immediately explain. The region surrounding the River Exe and the rolling hills of South Devon is typically marked by soft terrain, muddy fields, coastal winds, and grazing land shaped by centuries of agriculture. But in the winter of 1855, after a period of snow and frost, residents across multiple villages began to notice something unusual etched into the frozen ground. It was not a single trail or isolated marking. It was a pattern, repeated, consistent, and stretching for miles across fields, rooftops, walls, and frozen rivers. What they saw were footprints, but not ordinary ones. The marks appeared as if made by a single creature walking in a continuous line, each imprint spaced with unnatural regularity. They measured roughly 4 inches in length, shaped like those of a hoofed animal, yet strikingly uniform in distance and direction. Most unusual of all, they did not behave like typical animal tracks. Instead of deviating around obstacles, the prints continued in straight lines, crossing haystacks, climbing over walls, and even passing through narrow drainage pipes as if physical barriers offered no resistance at all. Over the course of a single night and into the following day, reports of these prints spread rapidly across Devon. Witnesses described them appearing in areas that seemed impossible for any known animal to access in such a consistent pattern. Some villages reported that the tracks stretched for over 100 miles, forming a continuous line that defied practical explanation. Local accounts from the time attempted to make sense of what they were seeing. Some believed the marks belonged to a donkey or small hoofed animal, though the scale and behavior of the tracks made this difficult to reconcile. Others suggested the possibility of multiple animals moving in single file, though this too failed to explain the precision and continuity of the impressions. As the phenomenon became more widely discussed, newspapers across England picked up the story, giving it the name by which it is still known today: the Devil's Footprints. The name itself reflected not an official conclusion, but a cultural attempt to describe something that resisted conventional categorization. In a time when rural communities were deeply influenced by folklore and religious interpretation, the idea of an unseen or supernatural force passing through the countryside became part of the public imagination. Yet even within these interpretations, the physical details remained unchanged. The prints were real, documented, and observed by multiple independent witnesses. The conditions of that winter have been examined extensively in later years. Meteorological records suggest a period of unusual snowfall followed by rapid freezing and thawing cycles, which could have affected how impressions formed in the soil and snow. Some researchers propose that animals moving through partially frozen ground may have created distorted or elongated impressions that, under specific lighting and weather conditions, appeared more uniform than they truly were. One theory suggests the involvement of common animals such as foxes, badgers, or rodents, whose movement through soft snow could produce intermittent markings that later appeared continuous due to melting and refreezing. In this interpretation, gaps in tracks may have been erased by environmental conditions, creating the illusion of uninterrupted passage. However, this explanation does not fully account for reports of the tracks appearing on vertical surfaces. Accounts from the time describe prints running across barn doors, over rooftops, and along walls at heights that would be difficult for ground-based animals to achieve under normal circumstances. These observations, while recorded anecdotally, continue to complicate purely environmental explanations. Other interpretations move into less conventional territory. Some folkloric accounts from the region describe the idea of a nocturnal presence moving through the landscape, an entity not bound by terrain in the way physical animals are. These interpretations, while not grounded in empirical evidence, reflect how communities historically processed unexplained natural phenomena. There are also more modern speculative theories. Some suggest rare atmospheric conditions combined with animal behavior could produce optical illusions or misinterpretations of depth and direction, particularly under moonlight or overcast skies. In this view, human observers may have unconsciously connected discontinuous marks into a continuous narrative, filling in gaps where visibility was limited. Another line of thought considers the possibility of simultaneous environmental and biological factors. A combination of thawing snow, synchronized animal movement, and wind redistribution of surface layers might have created a temporary pattern that appeared more coherent than it actually was. Yet even this layered explanation struggles to fully replicate the reported scale and consistency of the phenomenon. What makes the devil's footprints particularly enduring is not just their appearance, but their suddenness. The tracks were not seen forming. They were discovered after the fact, already fully inscribed across the landscape. And then, just as suddenly, they ceased. No continuation was recorded in the following days. No repeat occurrence has been documented on the same scale since. The ground itself offers no memory beyond the marks it briefly held. Unlike written records or mechanical traces, footprints in soil are inherently temporary. They exist only in the narrow space between presence and disappearance, long enough to be observed, but not long enough to be preserved with certainty. And so the question remains embedded in the fields of Devon, where winter once recorded something that seemed to move with intention, yet without explanation. What passed through the landscape in that brief moment of frozen silence, leaving behind a trail that challenged both observation and understanding? And why has no similar pattern ever fully returned to confirm what was truly seen? From the silent countryside of Devon, where winter once etched impossible patterns into frozen earth, the narrative now rises away from the ground entirely, back into the sky, where objects are not shaped by soil or snow, but by wind, altitude, and control systems designed to prevent uncertainty. Yet even here, in the structured logic of military aviation, Something once drifted free of explanation. Something that behaved as if its mission continued, without anyone aboard to guide it. On the morning of August 16, 1942, off the coast of California, United States naval forces were conducting routine anti-submarine patrols during the height of World War II. The Pacific waters near San Francisco Bay were under constant observation, as airships and aircraft worked together to detect potential threats far beneath the surface. Among them was a U.S. Navy blimp designated L-8. The L-8 was part of a class of non-rigid airships used for coastal patrol and reconnaissance. Filled with helium and powered by twin engines, these blimps were typically crewed by 2 men. Their task was straightforward: observe, report, and return safely to base. That morning, L-8 lifted from its station at Treasure Island with 2 experienced crew members on board, Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams. Initial reports indicate a standard patrol operation. The blimp moved along its assigned route over the Pacific coastline, maintaining radio contact with ground stations. There was nothing unusual in its early transmissions. Weather conditions were stable, visibility was acceptable, and the mission proceeded as expected. Then, communication began to change. At approximately 7:38 a.m., L-8 radioed that it was investigating a possible oil slick in the waters below, an indication that could suggest submarine activity. Shortly after, the crew reported descending to examine the area more closely. This would be the last confirmed communication from the airship. What followed became one of the most unusual aviation recoveries in recorded history. Later that morning, residents in the coastal town of Daly City observed something unusual in the sky. The L-8 blimp appeared overhead, but something was wrong. It was drifting, not crashing violently, not spiraling, but moving with controlled instability, its engines silent, its course unpredictable. It eventually came down near the cliffs of Montara, where it made a relatively soft landing on land rather than water. When civilians and rescue personnel reached the airship, what they found deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The L-8 was intact. Its engines were still functioning in part, its equipment largely undamaged. The control cabin, however, was empty. Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams were gone. There were no signs of struggle, no distress indicators left behind, no parachutes deployed, no confirmed evidence of forced removal or external interference. The crew had simply vanished from inside a fully operational aircraft while it was still airborne. Even more puzzling, the radio headset was found inside the cabin, and one of the crew's shoes was discovered inside the gondola. The remaining equipment appeared orderly, as if the mission had been ongoing until the final moment. The blimp itself had continued flying on a near-straight course for several miles after the last communication, suggesting that at least one engine may have been running autonomously or under partial control. Eventually, fuel depletion or loss of control likely led to its gradual descent. Official investigations conducted by the U.S. Navy considered multiple explanations. The most immediate possibility involved an accidental fall from the aircraft. At the time, L-class blimps did not have enclosed cabins, meaning crew members were exposed to open air while performing observation tasks. It was conceivable that both men may have fallen overboard during the low-altitude inspection of the suspected oil slick. However, this explanation raised further questions. Why would both crew members fall simultaneously without issuing a distress call? Why was no equipment recovered from the ocean if such an incident occurred? And how did the blimp continue flying in a controlled manner afterward? Another interpretation considered mechanical or procedural error. It is possible that during descent, a sudden shift in ballast or operational adjustment created instability, potentially leading to an accident that removed both crew members from the gondola. Yet again, no physical evidence was recovered to confirm such an event. Search operations were conducted along the blimp's flight path, both over land and water. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of Cody or Adams was ever found. As the investigation expanded, more speculative interpretations began to emerge. Some suggested that the crew may have attempted an emergency landing in the water and become separated from the aircraft during impact or evacuation. However, the relatively intact condition of the blimp upon landing does not fully support a high-impact water crash scenario. Others proposed the possibility of wartime interference, though no enemy aircraft or submarine activity was ever confirmed in the immediate vicinity at that time. Radar coverage and naval logs did not indicate hostile engagement consistent with the disappearance. More unconventional theories have circulated over time. Some point to sudden environmental or atmospheric anomalies that could disorient crew members at low altitude over open water. Others explore the possibility of human error compounded by fatigue, miscommunication, or spatial disorientation in an exposed cockpit environment. There are also interpretations that move beyond conventional aviation analysis. Some suggest that the crew may have intentionally left the aircraft under unknown circumstances, though this raises further questions about motive, timing, and survival in open ocean conditions without equipment. Another line of thought considers the possibility of simultaneous accident and continued aircraft function, where the blimp itself remained stable long enough to continue flight without human control, eventually descending once fuel levels dropped. Yet even this does not account for the complete absence of physical remains or clear trace evidence. What remains central to the case is not only the disappearance of 2 trained naval personnel, but the behavior of the aircraft itself. It did not crash in a conventional sense. It did not signal distress in its final moments. It continued on a path that suggested intention, even when intention should no longer have been present. The L-8 was later recovered and returned to service, a silent structure carrying no answers within its frame. It functioned again, as if nothing had happened aboard it at all. And so the mystery persists in the space between sky and sea. What happened to Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams aboard the Ghost Blimp? And how did an aircraft designed for observation become a vessel that returned, without the observers who had set it in motion? From the silent flight of the L-8 blimp, an aircraft that returned to land intact but emptied of its 2 crew members, the narrative shifts once again, away from open skies and into something far more grounded, yet equally unsettling. This time, the mystery does not drift above coastlines or vanish into oceans. It arrives by hand, letter by letter, into the quiet routines of a small American town. Circleville, Ohio, sits along the rural stretches of central Ohio farmland, where roads are long, straight, and bordered by fields that change slowly with the seasons. In the mid-1970s, it was a town of familiar rhythms: school routes, factory shifts, church gatherings, and neighbors who often knew each other for generations. It was the kind of place where communication was expected to be direct, spoken, and personal. That expectation began to fracture in 1976. It started with a letter. An anonymous message arrived in the home of a local school bus driver named Mary Gillespie. The letter contained accusations, vague but pointed, suggesting she was involved in a secret relationship with the superintendent of schools. It was unsigned, no return address, no explanation of origin, only claims, written in a tone that suggested familiarity with her private life. At first, it might have been dismissed as a single act of malice or misunderstanding, but more letters followed. Each one expanded the accusations. Each one referenced details of local relationships, routines, and personal interactions that suggested the writer had access to intimate knowledge of the community. The tone of the messages varied, sometimes accusatory, sometimes warning, sometimes claiming moral authority over the town's private affairs. Then came the signs. At some point, signs began appearing along roadsides in and around Circleville. Large handwritten boards placed near intersections or along rural routes repeated the same accusations found in the letters. The private had become public. The anonymous voice had moved from paper into physical space. And still, no identity was confirmed. Mary Gillespie's husband, Paul Gillespie, reportedly attempted to confront the situation directly. According to later accounts, he began investigating the origin of the letters himself, trying to determine who within the community might be responsible. In August 1977, he died in what was officially ruled a car accident, his vehicle leaving the road and striking a utility pole under unclear circumstances. However, questions quickly emerged within the town. Some residents believed the circumstances of the crash warranted further examination, though no conclusive evidence of foul play was ever officially established. The timing of his death, coming amid the escalating letter campaign, added another layer of unease to an already complex situation. After his death, the letters did not stop. If anything, they intensified. The writer now referenced Paul Gillespie directly, continuing to send messages that blended personal accusation with references to ongoing events in the town. The level of detail in the letters suggested proximity, either physical, social, or observational. Whoever was writing them appeared to know where people were going, who they were speaking to, and what was happening in their daily routines. Investigations by local authorities attempted to trace handwriting, paper sources, and possible suspects. At various points, individuals were questioned, and some suspicions were raised within the community. Yet no definitive author was identified at that stage. The letters continued for years, shaping an atmosphere of tension that spread through Circleville's social fabric. The content of the letters often returned to the same central themes: alleged relationships, accusations of misconduct, and warnings directed at individuals involved in the investigation. But beneath the accusations lay something more persistent, a sense of surveillance. The writer appeared not only informed, but continuously updated, as if observing events in real time. This perception raised fundamental questions. Was the writer someone embedded within the community? Someone with access to personal information through employment, proximity, or social connection? Or was the knowledge contained in the letters exaggerated, reconstructed from rumor and observation rather than direct evidence? Over time, several suspects were considered. One of the most frequently discussed individuals was a man connected to local institutions who had knowledge of community operations and personal relationships. However, while suspicion existed, conclusive proof tying any single individual to all letters was never fully established during the initial investigation period. The mystery might have remained unresolved indefinitely, but years later, a breakthrough emerged from an unexpected direction. In the late 1990s, the case resurfaced when investigative efforts revisited old evidence. A man named Paul Freshour, who had been connected to earlier aspects of the case, became a focal point of renewed scrutiny. Handwriting analysis and circumstantial evidence were re-examined, and he was eventually convicted in connection with the letter-writing campaign. Yet even this development did not fully settle the matter in the public mind. Some accepted the conclusion as resolution. Others pointed to lingering inconsistencies, the possibility of additional contributors, the continued existence of letters even after imprisonment, and the broader pattern of knowledge reflected in the communications. The question shifted from simple authorship to something more complex: whether a single individual could account for the sustained reach and detail of the entire campaign. Meanwhile, the physical traces of the letters themselves remained. Handwritten pages, clipped sentences, roadside signs that once stood in rural Ohio wind. Each artifact suggested intention, but not necessarily clarity of origin. Psychological interpretations have also been considered. Some suggest that the letters may reflect obsessive behavior driven by personal grievance, misinterpretation, or escalating fixation on community relationships. In this view, the writer's identity becomes less important than the internal logic of the messages themselves, a pattern shaped by perception rather than objective surveillance. Other interpretations consider the possibility of multiple contributors, where initial letters inspired imitation or expansion by others within the community. This would explain variations in tone and content, though no definitive evidence has confirmed such a collective origin. There are also broader speculative readings that view the Circleville Letters not as isolated acts, but as a manifestation of social tension within a tightly connected rural environment, where private information circulates rapidly and anonymity can be sustained even within familiarity. And yet, even after investigation, conviction, and decades of reflection, not every question fully settles. Some letters remain difficult to place within a single authorship timeline. Some details continue to resist complete alignment with established narratives, and the emotional impact on the community remains part of its historical memory. What makes the Circleville Letters endure is not only the identity of the writer, but the method itself, the transformation of private suspicion into public text, and the way written words can shape reality in a town where everyone knows each other, but no one fully knows the source of the voice reaching them through paper. And so the question remains, quietly embedded in the history of Circleville. Who was truly behind the letters that spoke with such certainty about private lives? And how much of what was written reflected observation, imagination, or something still left unaccounted for in the space between truth and accusation? From the sealed envelopes of Circleville, where anonymous handwriting reshaped the boundaries between private lives and public suspicion, the narrative now expands far beyond Earth itself. The investigation leaves behind towns, forests, oceans, and even aircraft, moving outward into the silent vastness of space, where distance erases certainty and signals arrive after journeys measured in light years rather than miles. In this realm, even a single pulse of data can become a question that echoes for decades. The location of this next mystery is not a place in the traditional sense, but a point of observation. The Big Ear Radio Telescope in Delaware, Ohio, United States. Built to scan the skies for signs of extraterrestrial radio transmissions, it was part of a broader scientific effort known as SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Its purpose was straightforward in design, yet vast in implication: to listen, continuously and patiently, for any structured signal that might indicate intelligence beyond Earth. On August 15, 1977, during a routine scan of the Sagittarius constellation, the telescope recorded something unusual. It was a narrowband radio signal lasting for approximately 72 seconds. Unlike the background noise of cosmic radiation or natural astronomical phenomena, this signal appeared structured, concentrated, and unusually strong at a specific frequency, 1,420 megahertz, a frequency often considered significant in radio astronomy due to its association with hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. When the data was processed and printed, astronomer Jerry R. Amon circled the sequence of characters representing the signal's intensity and wrote a brief annotation in the margin. Wow! That single word would become the name of the event. The signal itself never repeated. Subsequent observations of the same region of space yielded no similar transmissions. Despite repeated scanning attempts, the precise source area returned only background noise, indistinguishable from the surrounding cosmic environment. The brief anomaly remained isolated, a single recorded moment without replication or continuation. From a scientific perspective, several explanations were considered. One possibility involves terrestrial interference, human-made signals reflecting off satellites or space debris, creating a temporary distortion in the data. However, extensive analysis of the signal's characteristics suggested it was unlikely to have originated from Earth-based sources, particularly due to its narrow frequency band and lack of identifiable modulation patterns typical of terrestrial communication systems. Another interpretation considers natural astrophysical phenomena. Certain cosmic sources, such as pulsars or hydrogen clouds, can emit radio frequencies under specific conditions. Yet none of the known natural mechanisms fully account for the signal's intensity profile and its precise alignment within the hydrogen line frequency range. The location in the sky where the signal originated adds another layer of complexity. It pointed toward a region near the constellation Sagittarius, an area dense with stars and galactic activity. However, no known astronomical object at that position has been identified as a repeating radio source matching the characteristics of the WOW signal. As a result, the signal remains classified as an unexplained radio event, neither confirmed as extraterrestrial communication nor fully explained by known natural or artificial sources. Over time, as data processing methods improved and new radio telescopes came online, researchers revisited the signal's parameters. Attempts were made to triangulate its origin more precisely and to search archival data for similar patterns. Yet despite these efforts, no exact match has ever been found. This absence of repetition is central to its enduring mystery. In radio astronomy, transient signals are not uncommon. What makes the WOW signal unusual is not only its strength and structure, but its singularity. It appeared once, then vanished completely. Naturally, this has led to a range of interpretations beyond standard astrophysical models. One line of thought considers the possibility of an intermittent natural source, an astronomical event that occurred briefly and has not recurred in a detectable way. This could include rare emissions from cosmic bodies undergoing temporary energetic fluctuations. However, no known mechanism fully replicates the observed signal characteristics within current scientific understanding. Another perspective explores the idea of directed transmission from an artificial source. In this interpretation, the signal could represent a brief attempt at communication from an extraterrestrial intelligence, intentionally or unintentionally transmitted toward Earth. The lack of repetition could suggest a one-time broadcast, a misaligned signal, or a form of communication not designed for continuous detection. There are also more cautious interpretations that emphasize limitations in observational coverage. The signal may have been part of a longer pattern that was not captured in full due to telescope scheduling, directional constraints, or sensitivity thresholds. In this view, what was recorded is only a fragment of a larger, unseen transmission sequence. Yet even these explanations do not fully resolve the central anomaly. The precision of the signal's frequency alignment, its strength relative to background noise, and its complete absence in all subsequent observations. The Big Ear telescope itself has long since been decommissioned, its physical structure no longer part of active scientific research. But the data it captured continues to circulate through academic analysis, SETI archives, and public fascination. What makes the WOW signal particularly compelling is not only what was detected, but what was not. No accompanying visual data, no repeated transmission, no confirmed source. Just a single recorded moment in 1977, preserved on printout paper, annotated by a word that captured both scientific curiosity and uncertainty. And so the signal remains suspended in the observational record of the universe, a brief interruption in cosmic silence that has never returned to confirm its origin. Was it a natural fluctuation in the vast background noise of space, never to be repeated? Or could it have been a momentary structured transmission from a source we have not yet learned how to recognize or understand? And if it was a message of any kind, what does it mean that the universe has never spoken in quite the same way since? From the silent echo of a signal that arrived from deep space and never repeated, the narrative now returns abruptly to Earth, where the sky is closer, the air heavier, and the unknown does not come through telescopes, but through direct human experience. This time, the mystery does not begin in scientific observatories or remote oceans. It begins on a rural Texas highway, where night travel and open roads create a sense of isolation that can make even familiar landscapes feel unfamiliar. The setting is East Texas, near the town of Dayton, along a stretch of road bordered by dense pine forest and scattered rural properties. It is December 29, 1980. The night is cold, clear, and quiet, conditions that usually make driving uneventful, visibility steady, and horizons easy to read. For most travelers, this would be an ordinary evening on a long rural route. But for three individuals, Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and Vicki's 7-year-old grandson, Colby Landrum, that night would become something far outside the expected pattern of ordinary experience. They were driving home late in the evening when they reportedly observed an unusual light in the sky ahead of them. At first, it was described as a distant glow, bright enough to draw attention but not yet clearly defined. As they continued along the road, the light appeared to grow in intensity and proximity, until it became unmistakably dominant in the sky above the tree line. According to their later testimony, the object they encountered was not a conventional aircraft. It was described as a massive diamond-shaped structure emitting intense heat and light. The brightness was so strong that it illuminated the surrounding forest and roadway, creating sharp contrasts between shadow and glare. The witnesses reported that the object appeared to hover above the road, accompanied by a formation of smaller aircraft-like shapes positioned around it. The main structure was said to emit a fiery or torch-like glow, with visible heat effects strong enough to be felt through the vehicle's windows. As the vehicle stopped on the roadside, the intensity of the encounter increased. The occupants reportedly experienced physical symptoms almost immediately. Betty Cash, who exited the vehicle at one point, later described severe burning sensations on her skin, followed by blistering and long-term medical complications. All three individuals experienced varying degrees of nausea, eye irritation, and physical distress after the encounter. Shortly afterward, the object and accompanying lights moved away from the area at high speed, disappearing into the night sky. What remained was not only a memory, but physical aftermath. Medical records later documented symptoms consistent with radiation or thermal exposure, though no definitive environmental source was identified in the immediate area. The condition of the vehicle and surrounding environment was also examined, but no conventional explanation, such as fire, chemical exposure, or industrial accident, was conclusively linked to the incident. The witnesses sought medical attention and later pursued formal complaints and investigations regarding their experience. Their accounts remained consistent over time, though naturally subject to interpretation, skepticism, and competing explanations. From an official investigative standpoint, the incident has never been conclusively explained. No military operation was formally acknowledged in the area at the time. No civilian aircraft activity matching the description was confirmed in flight records. Radar data from nearby installations did not definitively identify an object matching the reported characteristics. This absence of verification created space for multiple interpretations. One line of explanation considers the possibility of misidentified conventional phenomena. Some researchers suggest that the witnesses may have observed a combination of aircraft lighting effects, atmospheric conditions, and optical illusions created by temperature variation or reflection in humid air. In this view, the perception of a structured object could result from cognitive interpretation of ambiguous stimuli under stress. However, this explanation struggles to account for the reported physical effects, particularly the thermal sensation and subsequent medical symptoms described by all three witnesses. Another interpretation considers the possibility of a classified military aircraft or experimental technology. The early 1980s were a period of rapid advancement in aerospace development, including stealth research and unconventional propulsion studies. It has been suggested that the object could have been part of a test program not publicly disclosed, possibly involving unconventional heat generation or propulsion systems. yet no official documentation or declassified records have confirmed such an operation in that specific region or time frame. A further perspective explores environmental or geological explanations. Some theories suggest that naturally occurring atmospheric phenomena, such as rare plasma events, electrical discharges, or geophysical energy releases, could produce intense light and heat signatures under specific conditions. In this interpretation, the object may not have been a physical craft at all, but a transient atmospheric event misinterpreted as structured machinery. Still, such phenomena are not typically associated with sustained directional movement or the reported formation of multiple surrounding lights. As with many unexplained cases, speculative interpretations have also emerged beyond conventional scientific frameworks. Some accounts describe the possibility of unidentified aerial phenomena exhibiting behavior not currently understood within known aerospace or atmospheric science. These interpretations do not assert origin, but instead emphasize the limitations of current observational frameworks when encountering rare or poorly documented events. Others frame the encounter as a perceptual convergence, where environmental stress, darkness, and unexpected stimuli combine to create a shared but distorted interpretation of an ambiguous event. In this view, the consistency between witnesses is not evidence of external structure, but of shared human response to extreme sensory input. Yet even within these explanations, certain details remain difficult to fully integrate. The reported heat effects, the prolonged visibility of the object, and the subsequent physical symptoms continue to sit at the edge of conventional classification. Unlike many mysteries that exist only in records or recordings, the Cash-Landrum Incident is anchored in physical testimony, human bodies that experienced measurable aftereffects, a vehicle that remained as a silent witness, and a night sky that offered no recorded confirmation of what was seen. Over time, the incident has become part of a broader archive of unexplained aerial encounters, cases where observation, physical sensation, and official records do not fully align into a single coherent narrative. It exists in a space where documentation is partial and interpretation remains divided. What makes this case particularly persistent is not only the intensity of the experience, but the clarity of the witnesses' accounts. There is no ambiguity in their description of what they believe they saw. The uncertainty lies not in their perception, but in the absence of an external record that confirms or denies it. And so the event remains suspended between explanation and uncertainty. A night on a quiet Texas road where light filled the sky, heat touched the ground, and 3 individuals encountered something that left marks both visible and invisible. Was it a rare convergence of environmental and human perception under extreme conditions, a classified technological event never publicly acknowledged, or something that still lies outside the boundaries of current understanding? And what does it mean when an experience leaves behind physical consequences, yet no identifiable source to account for them? From the glowing horizon over rural Texas, where an unidentified light left behind physical consequences and unanswered questions, the narrative now returns to a quieter setting once again, where the mystery does not arrive from the sky or deep space, but seeps instead into the fabric of an ordinary American town. A place where homes are close enough to hear neighbors through thin walls, where streets are familiar enough to be walked in the dark without fear, and where daily life is usually defined by routine rather than intrusion. That town is Mattoon, Illinois. In the late summer of 1944, during the final years of World War II, Mattoon was a small industrial community surrounded by farmland and connected by rail lines that carried both goods and information across the region. It was not a place accustomed to national attention. Yet, over the course of several nights in August and September, it became the center of a wave of reports that would unsettle both residents and authorities. It began quietly, almost indistinctly, one household, then another, reporting a strange and unsettling experience during the night. Residents described awakening to a strong, unfamiliar odor entering their homes through open windows. The scent was often compared to something sweet, metallic, or chemical in nature, though descriptions varied from household to household. Shortly after exposure, those affected reported physical reactions. Symptoms included nausea, dizziness, temporary paralysis of limbs, and difficulty breathing. In some cases, individuals claimed to have felt pressure or irritation in the throat and chest, as if the air itself had become contaminated or altered. What made the reports particularly unusual was not just the symptoms themselves, but the consistency with which they appeared across separate homes in different parts of the town. The incidents seemed to occur at night, often when residents were asleep, and typically involved open windows or ventilation through which the odor was said to have entered. As the number of reports increased, so too did concern within the community. Local newspapers began covering the incidents, describing what was soon labeled by journalists as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. The name itself reflected not an official classification, but a growing cultural attempt to define an unseen presence that seemed to move through the town without clear origin or pattern. Law enforcement began investigations, interviewing affected residents and attempting to identify environmental or human sources for the reported gas. Police patrols were increased, streets were monitored, suspected individuals were questioned. Yet despite these efforts, no physical source of gas or chemical agent was ever identified. No containers were recovered. No equipment was found. No industrial leaks or agricultural chemical releases were confirmed in the area that matched the timing or symptoms described. This absence of material evidence created a widening gap between experience and explanation. Some early interpretations considered the possibility of industrial exposure or accidental release of chemical substances used in wartime manufacturing processes. During the 1940s, many communities were located near facilities handling solvents, fuels, and other volatile compounds. However, investigations did not uncover any confirmed leaks or environmental contamination events that corresponded with the reported timeline. Another explanation considered the possibility of mass hysteria or psychological suggestion. In this view, initial reports of illness may have influenced subsequent perceptions, leading individuals to interpret normal environmental sensations, such as pollen, smoke, or household chemicals, as part of a shared narrative of intrusion. This phenomenon, where collective anxiety amplifies perceived symptoms, has been documented in other historical contexts. Yet even this interpretation faces challenges. The physical symptoms reported by multiple individuals, often independently and in different households, were described in consistent terms and sometimes observed directly by witnesses within families. There were also reports of sightings. Some residents claimed to have seen a figure outside homes during the time of the incidents. A person described as male, dressed in dark clothing, sometimes observed near windows or moving along property lines. However, these sightings were inconsistent, and no individual was ever conclusively identified or apprehended in connection with the reports. As the weeks progressed, the incidents gradually decreased in frequency. The wave of reports eventually subsided, leaving behind no definitive cause, no confirmed perpetrator, and no physical source that could be examined or tested. Official conclusions at the time leaned toward the absence of a tangible chemical agent, suggesting that no external gas attack or industrial accident had occurred. However, this did not fully resolve the question of what residents experienced during those nights. Over time, the case entered a broader category of unexplained mass experiences, events where multiple individuals report similar sensations or perceptions in the absence of identifiable environmental triggers. These cases often sit at the intersection of environmental science, psychology, and social behavior, where interpretation becomes as complex as observation itself. Some later analyses suggest that environmental factors such as insecticides, household chemicals, or natural gases could have produced mild physical effects that were then amplified by fear and expectation. Others propose that individual medical conditions or allergic reactions may have been misinterpreted as evidence of an external agent. Still, these explanations do not fully account for the reported consistency across multiple households, nor the descriptions of a distinct and unusual odor preceding symptoms. In more speculative interpretations, the event has been framed as a rare case of unknown atmospheric or environmental interaction, something not fully documented within mid-20th century chemical knowledge. However, no evidence has emerged to support the existence of such a substance or phenomenon in the region at that time. There are also interpretations that focus less on external causation and more on perception itself. The idea that under conditions of wartime stress, media awareness, and community anxiety, ordinary stimuli can become reinterpreted through a shared narrative framework. In this view, the Mad Gasser is less a physical entity and more a collective construct shaped by timing, fear, and suggestion. And yet, the reports remain recorded, not as abstract impressions, but as documented accounts from individuals who described tangible physical effects, sudden onset symptoms, and the sensation of an unseen presence entering private spaces during the night. What makes the Mattoon case particularly enduring is the way it blurs the boundary between environmental possibility and perceptual experience. It does not present a single dramatic event, but rather a sequence of repeated incidents that resist simple categorization. No confirmed source was ever identified. No definitive explanation achieved consensus. And no repeat of the phenomenon has been documented in the same form within the town since that period. And so the question remains embedded in the quiet streets of Mattoon, where memory still holds traces of those nights. What moved through the town in the summer of 1944? Was it a misunderstood environmental exposure, a psychological chain reaction, a hidden human presence never identified, or something that still sits outside the boundaries of what has been fully measured or named? And why did it appear only briefly, before vanishing without leaving a trace that could be definitively followed? Continuing from the previous segment of this unfolding exploration into the world's most persistent urban mysteries, we now turn to a case that unsettled an entire metropolis at the turn of the 21st century, one that blurred the boundary between rumor, panic, and perception. In the dense, restless sprawl of Delhi, where ancient history and modern life exist in constant overlap, the summer nights of 2001 carried an unusual tension. The city was alive as always, traffic horns echoing through narrow streets, rooftop conversations drifting into the humid air, and the flicker of streetlights struggling against darkness. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, something unfamiliar began to take shape in the collective imagination of its residents. It started with scattered reports. A figure, described in inconsistent but eerily similar ways, was said to be moving across rooftops in the dead of night. Witnesses spoke of something fast, unnaturally fast, leaping between buildings with ease that defied expectation. Some said it resembled a human, but not entirely. Others insisted it was covered in dark fur, with glowing or reflective eyes that caught the faint light of the city. The name that would eventually define the phenomenon emerged almost instinctively: the Monkey Man of Delhi. What makes this case particularly compelling is not just the description of the figure, but the speed at which belief spread. Within days, isolated sightings transformed into a citywide narrative. Reports emerged from different neighborhoods, Mayur Vihar, Karawal Nagar, and beyond, each adding new fragments to the growing mosaic of fear. Some claimed to have been attacked, reporting scratches or bruises, though medical evidence often remained inconclusive or inconsistent with their descriptions. Authorities attempted to maintain calm, suggesting that mass hysteria, misidentification, or even groups of monkeys, common in parts of Delhi, could explain the phenomenon. Indeed, rhesus macaques are a familiar presence in the city, often seen on walls, rooftops, and temple grounds. Their movements, particularly at night, can appear sudden and startling under poor lighting conditions. But for many residents, this explanation felt insufficient. It did not account for the structured, almost intentional behavior described in multiple accounts. It did not explain the sense of being watched, or the coordinated panic that seemed to ripple through entire communities. As the reports multiplied, so did the atmosphere of uncertainty. Night patrols were organized in several districts. Some residents armed themselves with sticks or makeshift tools, gathering in groups to guard rooftops. The line between vigilance and fear began to blur. In certain neighborhoods, people avoided going outside after dusk entirely. The city, normally defined by its movement, began to develop pockets of stillness. Yet, when examined through a more analytical lens, the evidence remains elusive. No clear photographic or video proof emerged that could definitively confirm the existence of a new creature or entity. Grainy images circulated briefly, but they were too indistinct to verify. Most accounts relied heavily on personal testimony, which, while sincere, varied significantly in detail. Height estimates ranged wildly. Some described horns, others metallic claws. The inconsistency itself becomes part of the mystery. Psychologists and sociologists later pointed to the phenomenon of mass psychogenic illness, commonly known as mass hysteria, as a possible explanation. In high-stress environments, particularly in densely populated urban areas, fear can propagate rapidly, shaping perception itself. One person's startled reaction can become another's confirmation of danger. Over time, expectation and reality can merge in ways that are difficult to untangle. Still, not all interpretations fit neatly within psychological frameworks. Some researchers suggested that the Monkey Man sightings could have been triggered by a combination of environmental factors: poor lighting, nocturnal animals, sleep deprivation, and the natural human tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli in familiar narrative forms. In this view, the creature was not a singular being, but a pattern constructed by the mind under uncertain conditions. However, fringe interpretations persist. Some local folklore traditions speak of protective spirits or shape-shifting entities that appear during periods of social imbalance. Others have speculated about experimental animals escaping containment or undiscovered species adapting to urban environments. None of these theories have produced verifiable evidence, yet they continue to circulate in discussions, adding layers to an already complex story. What makes the Monkey Man of Delhi particularly enduring is not just what was reported, but what was felt. Fear, once shared, acquires its own momentum. Entire communities responded not only to what they saw, but to what they believed others had seen. In that sense, the phenomenon becomes less about the physical existence of a creature and more about the psychology of perception itself. As weeks passed, the intensity of reports gradually diminished. The sightings became less frequent, the patrols less organized, and the city slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet the questions remained suspended in memory. What exactly moved across those rooftops in the summer of 2001? Was it a misidentified animal, a series of coincidences amplified by fear, or something that was never fully captured by any explanation offered? Even today, the Monkey Man of Delhi exists in a space between record and recollection. It is documented in police reports, discussed in academic papers, and retold in local stories, but never conclusively resolved. The absence of definitive proof does not erase the experience of those who lived through it. And so the question lingers, as it often does in the quiet aftermath of collective uncertainty. When so many people see something that cannot be fully explained, what does that say about the nature of what was seen, or about the nature of seeing itself? The fading echoes of that summer in Delhi do not mark an ending, but rather a shift, away from public alarm and back into the quieter layers of memory, where unresolved events tend to settle rather than disappear. In the months that followed the peak of the sightings, life in the city resumed its familiar rhythm. Markets reopened without hesitation, rooftop terraces filled again with evening conversations, and the urgency that once gripped entire neighborhoods slowly dissolved into anecdote. Yet in certain parts of Delhi, especially where the reports had been most concentrated, the story did not vanish so easily. It transformed. People began recounting the events not as a single coherent episode, but as fragments, moments of confusion in otherwise ordinary nights. A shadow leaping across a wall, a sound that did not match any known animal, a sudden panic that spread faster than any visible cause. Over time, these fragments detached from their original urgency and became something closer to folklore, passed between neighbors with a tone that blended curiosity and hesitation. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Monkey Man accounts is how little agreement there is on its form. Some described it as distinctly simian, with elongated limbs and agile movement patterns consistent with urban monkeys already present in the region. Others insisted it stood more upright, almost human in posture, with features obscured by darkness or rapid motion. A smaller subset of reports included even more unusual details: mechanical sounds, glowing elements, or unnatural silence in its presence. These variations, rather than clarifying the phenomenon, deepen its ambiguity. From a biological standpoint, the simplest explanations remain the most widely accepted. Delhi is home to large populations of rhesus macaques, highly adaptable primates capable of navigating dense urban structures with remarkable agility. Under low-light conditions, especially when observed briefly or from a distance, their movements can appear exaggerated or unfamiliar. Add to this the effects of fatigue, stress, and suggestion, and the human mind begins to complete patterns that are not fully there. But explanation, even when plausible, does not always settle perception. In several documented cases during the height of the panic, individuals reported seeing the figure simultaneously from different vantage points, sometimes even in crowded areas where visibility should have made misidentification less likely. These accounts are often treated cautiously by researchers, yet they persist in the record, resistant to complete dismissal. Whether these are errors of memory, synchronized misinterpretations, or something else entirely remains unresolved. Sociologists studying the event have pointed out a critical factor: timing. The early 2000s in Delhi were a period of rapid urban expansion, shifting demographics, and increasing strain on infrastructure. In such environments, collective anxiety can find unexpected focal points. A single ambiguous sighting, once shared, can evolve into a shared narrative framework through which unrelated experiences are interpreted. The Monkey Man, in this reading, is less an entity and more a convergence of perception under pressure. Still, not all interpretations remain grounded in psychology or ecology. In local oral traditions, there are older stories, far predating the modern city, of nocturnal guardians, half-seen figures that appear during moments of transition or imbalance. These narratives, while not directly linked to the 2001 events, often resurface in hindsight as people search for cultural memory that might accommodate what they experienced. Whether this is meaningful connection or retrospective pattern building is difficult to determine. Interestingly, official investigations at the time never produced a conclusive finding. Authorities acknowledged the reports, conducted patrols, and issued public reassurances, but ultimately found no physical evidence of a new or unknown creature operating in the city. No specimens, no consistent photographic documentation, no environmental traces that could support the more extraordinary claims. The absence of evidence, however, did little to erase the emotional reality of the experience for those who believed they had encountered something real. Over time, the Monkey Man phenomenon became a case study, not only in urban legend formation, but in the mechanics of perception itself. How does a city as vast and densely populated as Delhi collectively interpret ambiguity? At what point does uncertainty become shared reality? And perhaps most importantly, why do certain images, once formed, refuse to fully dissolve even after explanation arrives? Today, the story survives in multiple forms. It appears in academic discussions on mass psychology, in documentaries exploring urban myths, and in casual conversations where it is retold with varying degrees of belief. Each retelling adds slight variation, as if the story itself is still being adjusted, still searching for a stable form. And so the Monkey Man of Delhi remains suspended in that uncertain space between fact and interpretation. Not fully confirmed, not entirely dismissed. An echo of a moment when a city looked into the darkness and briefly saw something it could not collectively define. Was it ever a single presence moving across the rooftops, or only the reflection of many minds interpreting the same darkness in different ways? Continuing from the unresolved tension of the Monkey Man reports in Delhi, the focus of mystery shifts, from what was seen in the shadows of rooftops to what is heard in the silence of everyday life. Sight gave way to sound, and unlike a figure that can vanish into darkness, sound lingers differently. It seeps into walls, into sleep, into thought itself. Across the world, in widely separated places with no obvious connection, people began reporting something unusual, a low-frequency noise, persistent, indistinct, sometimes described as a distant engine idling far beyond the horizon, sometimes like a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It had no clear origin, no consistent pattern. And yet, those who heard it often described it in almost identical terms. It came to be known simply as the hum. In the quiet desert town of Taos, one of the earliest widely documented cases emerged in the early 1990s. Residents reported a faint but persistent sound, most noticeable at night or in still air. Unlike passing traffic or industrial machinery, this sound seemed to lack direction. Some described it as internal, as though it was not entering from the outside world, but arising within perception itself. Local investigations were carried out, including scientific surveys and acoustic measurements. Sensitive equipment was deployed. Microphones were positioned in open landscapes and residential zones. Yet the results were inconclusive. Some recordings captured low-frequency signals, but none that could definitively account for the widespread human experience of hearing the hum. What makes the phenomenon particularly compelling is not just its presence in one location, but its repetition across the globe. In the port city of Bristol, residents also began reporting a similar persistent noise. Here, the hum was often described as more mechanical, sometimes compared to distant industrial activity. Yet again, no single source could be identified. Investigations pointed to possibilities ranging from ventilation systems to underground infrastructure, but nothing fully matched the consistency of reports. Meanwhile, in Largs, another coastal community became associated with the same unexplained auditory experience. As in other locations, not everyone heard it. This selective perception added another layer of complexity. Why would only certain individuals detect a sound that others, in the same environment, could not perceive at all? This question becomes central to the mystery of the hum. Is it external, or is it, in part, shaped by the human mind? Scientific explanations have often focused on environmental and physiological sources. Low-frequency sound waves, known as infrasound, can be produced by natural phenomena such as ocean waves, wind interacting with terrain, or even distant industrial machinery. These frequencies are sometimes below the threshold of conscious hearing, yet they can still be felt, manifesting as discomfort, pressure, or vague auditory impressions. Another possibility involves modern infrastructure. Electrical transformers, ventilation systems, and industrial equipment can generate constant low-level vibrations. In densely built environments, these sources can overlap, creating complex acoustic patterns that are difficult to isolate. Yet even these explanations struggle to account for the consistency of experience across geographically and culturally distinct regions. In Kokomo, for example, residents reported a hum that persisted for years, prompting formal investigations. Engineers and acousticians conducted extensive surveys, testing industrial sites and utility systems. Some potential sources were identified and modified, and in certain cases the intensity of the hum reportedly decreased. But for others, the sound never fully disappeared. Then there is the case of Windsor, where one of the most documented versions of the phenomenon emerged. Residents described a deep, diesel-like vibration, sometimes strong enough to rattle windows and disturb sleep. Unlike more subtle cases, this version had a physical intensity that made it difficult to dismiss as purely psychological. Investigations explored nearby industrial facilities, transportation routes, and even cross-border sources of vibration. Still, no definitive cause was universally accepted. As patterns repeat across continents, researchers have been forced to consider broader interpretations. Some propose that the hum may arise from a combination of environmental noise and human auditory sensitivity. In this view, the phenomenon is not a single sound, but a convergence of multiple low-level signals interpreted by the brain as a unified experience. Others suggest a neurological component. Certain individuals may possess heightened sensitivity to low-frequency vibrations or internal auditory processing that interprets ambiguous sensory input as persistent sound. This could explain why only a portion of the population reports hearing the hum, even within the same household. But these explanations, while grounded in measurable science, do not fully resolve the deeper uncertainty. Why does the hum feel so consistent in its emotional effect? Across testimonies, regardless of location, similar descriptions emerge. A sense of unease, difficulty sleeping, an awareness of something present but unseen. Even when individuals cannot agree on the exact nature of the sound, they often agree on its psychological impact. And then there are interpretations that move beyond conventional science. Some speculative theories suggest that the hum may be related to electromagnetic phenomena, atmospheric interactions, or large-scale geophysical processes not yet fully understood. Others propose more abstract ideas, that it could be a byproduct of human civilization itself, an acoustic shadow created by the constant mechanical activity of modern infrastructure layered across the planet. There are even cultural interpretations that frame the hum as a kind of collective auditory hallucination, emerging in societies with high levels of environmental stress and sensory overload. In this view, the sound is not external at all, but a shared perceptual construct, an echo of modern life interpreted through the nervous system. Yet none of these frameworks have achieved consensus. The hum remains resistant to classification. What makes it particularly intriguing is its persistence despite investigation. Unlike many mysteries that fade when studied, the hum seems to persist in parallel with scientific inquiry. In some regions it diminishes, in others it continues unchanged, and in many places it is reported intermittently, appearing, disappearing, and reappearing without clear pattern. It is this unpredictability that keeps the phenomenon alive in public awareness, not as a singular event, but as a recurring question. In recent years, technological advances in acoustic mapping and environmental monitoring have improved our ability to detect low-frequency sound sources with greater precision. Yet even with these tools, a complete explanation remains elusive. data can identify vibrations, but it cannot fully capture the subjective experience of those who hear something they cannot ignore. And so the mystery remains suspended between measurement and perception. Is the hum a hidden global frequency, woven into the background of modern civilization? Is it a natural phenomenon still too subtle or complex to fully map? Or does it exist somewhere closer to human consciousness itself, shaped as much by the listener as by the environment? Like distant echoes following the rooftop shadows of Delhi's Monkey Man, the hum suggests a different kind of uncertainty, not about what is seen, but about what is heard, and how the mind gives shape to what refuses to stay silent. As the investigation into the hum continues to drift between continents and interpretations, the narrative naturally shifts toward another case where perception itself seems to bend under pressure, this time not through sound or shadow, but through the fragile boundaries of memory and identity. In the quiet countryside of Enfield during the late 1970s, a series of events began to unfold inside an ordinary suburban home. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable. Brick walls, small garden, familiar architecture of post-war England. Yet within its rooms, a story developed that would later be discussed in paranormal literature for decades: the Enfield poltergeist. At the center of the case were reports of unexplained disturbances, furniture shifting without visible cause, knocking sounds echoing through walls, objects appearing to move on their own. But unlike many folklore-driven accounts, this case was documented in real time by journalists, photographers, and investigators who spent long nights inside the house, observing and recording what they claimed to witness. Among the most frequently cited sources are the investigations conducted by researchers from the Society for Psychical Research. Their reports describe furniture that seemed to tilt or slide without mechanical explanation, and rhythmic knocking that responded, at least at times, to questions posed aloud in the room. Yet even within these accounts, certainty is elusive. Some investigators expressed belief in a genuine unexplained force, while others noted inconsistencies in the behavior of events, suggesting possible human involvement. The children living in the house became central figures in the narrative. One in particular, a young girl, was often reported to exhibit unusual vocal phenomena during episodes of disturbance, deep, rough voices that contrasted sharply with her normal speech. These moments were recorded and widely circulated, becoming some of the most debated elements of the case. Yet, whether these occurrences represented something external acting upon the environment or psychological responses under stress remains unresolved. What makes the Enfield case especially compelling is not only what was reported, but how it was documented. Unlike distant legends or fragmented testimonies, this was a phenomenon observed by multiple witnesses over extended periods. Photographs exist, audio recordings exist, written accounts exist. And yet, even with this level of documentation, interpretation diverges sharply. Skeptical analyses have pointed to possible hoaxes or exaggerations, noting that certain movements could have been staged or influenced by suggestion. Others argue that environmental factors, such as structural settling of the building or natural acoustic effects, might explain some of the reported phenomena. Psychological explanations also play a significant role in modern interpretations, particularly the idea that heightened attention and expectation can shape perception in shared environments. But those who were present often describe something harder to dismiss: a sense that events unfolded with a consistency that resisted simple categorization. Not constant chaos, but intermittent disturbances that seemed to follow no clear pattern. Moments of silence interrupted by sudden activity. Questions answered by knocks that seemed to anticipate intent. In later years, alternative interpretations began to emerge. Some researchers suggested that the case might reflect a complex interaction between adolescent psychology and environmental stress, where subconscious expression manifests in externalized behavior. Others proposed that collective attention itself, intense observation by investigators, journalists, and family members, may have influenced how events were perceived and recorded. Still, the question remains: why do similar patterns appear across unrelated accounts of poltergeist activity in different parts of the world? From Europe to North America, reports of unexplained household disturbances share recurring features: nocturnal timing, adolescent presence, intermittent activity, and a blend of physical and auditory phenomena. Whether this reflects a shared psychological mechanism or something less understood continues to be debated. As with the Hum, the Enfield case occupies a space where measurement and experience do not fully align. Instruments can record sound. Cameras can capture movement. Yet interpretation still depends on human perception, and perception is never entirely neutral. And perhaps that is what gives these stories their persistence. Not the certainty of what occurred, but the instability of how it is understood. In more speculative discussions, some have suggested that cases like Enfield represent interactions with phenomena that exist at the edge of perception, events that are not fully external or internal, but somewhere between. Others argue that such explanations risk moving too far beyond evidence, transforming gaps in understanding into narratives of their own. What remains indisputable is that something was experienced, recorded, and remembered by those who lived through it. But what that something actually was continues to resist closure. And so the Enfield case, like the Hum before it, remains suspended in ambiguity. A domestic space where ordinary life briefly intersected with something that defied easy explanation. Was it a manifestation of unseen forces within the environment, or a reflection of the human mind under observation and stress? And if certainty cannot be reached even here, inside a documented and heavily studied case, what does that suggest about the limits of what can ever truly be known? From the unresolved presence of the Hum, an unseen frequency reported across distant landscapes without a single confirmed origin, the narrative now narrows its focus once more, moving from global ambiguity to a specific point in the high desert of northern New Mexico. A place where silence is expected to dominate the environment, where wide skies meet sparse settlements, and where sound, when it occurs, usually has a clear and identifiable source. That place is Taos. Surrounded by the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the town of Taos sits in a landscape shaped by elevation, wind, and open space. It is a region known for its stillness, where nightfall often brings a level of quiet that feels almost absolute. Yet beginning in the early 1990s, some residents began to report something that disrupted this expectation: a low-frequency sound. Not loud, not rhythmic in a conventional sense, but persistent, faint, and deeply unsettling to those who could perceive it. It came to be known as the Taos Hum. Unlike sudden events or visible phenomena, the Taos Hum does not announce itself in dramatic form. It is described instead as a continuous background presence, something between a distant engine, a faint electrical vibration, and a deep, resonant tone that seems to exist just below the threshold of ordinary hearing. Importantly, not everyone hears it. This selective perception became one of the central features of the phenomenon. In Taos and surrounding areas, only a small percentage of residents reported experiencing the sound, while others in the same environment perceived complete silence. This inconsistency immediately complicated efforts to identify an external source. For those who do hear it, the experience is often difficult to ignore. It is most noticeable in quiet environments, indoors at night, or in rural areas away from traffic and mechanical noise. Some describe it as constant. Others say it fluctuates in intensity. A few report that it seems to change direction or spatial presence, as if moving through the surrounding environment rather than originating from a fixed point. Local reports eventually gained enough attention to prompt formal investigation. In the early 1990s, researchers and engineers examined the area using acoustic measurement equipment, attempting to detect any consistent low-frequency signals that might explain the phenomenon. Sensitive microphones, vibration detectors, and environmental monitoring tools were deployed in and around Taos. The results, however, were inconclusive. In many cases, no unusual acoustic signal could be recorded at the moments when individuals reported hearing the hum. This discrepancy between subjective experience and measurable data became one of the defining challenges of the investigation. Several mainstream explanations were explored. One possibility involved industrial or mechanical sources operating at low frequencies, such as electrical transformers, distant machinery, or underground utilities. Low-frequency vibrations can travel long distances through soil and structures, sometimes becoming perceptible under specific environmental conditions. However, no single infrastructure source in the Taos region was identified as consistently responsible for the reported experiences. Another explanation considered the role of infrasound, sound waves below the typical range of human hearing. Infrasound can be produced by natural phenomena such as wind interacting with terrain, atmospheric pressure changes, or seismic microactivity. While these vibrations are real and measurable, they do not always translate into audible perception. Yet under certain conditions, they may be felt indirectly, creating sensations of pressure or discomfort that some individuals interpret as sound. Still, in Taos, measurements did not consistently reveal an infrasound source strong enough to account for all reports. This led researchers to consider the possibility that the phenomenon might not originate from a single external cause. Instead, some interpretations suggest a convergence of multiple subtle environmental factors, each individually harmless or imperceptible, but collectively producing conditions under which certain individuals perceive a persistent auditory sensation. In this framework, the Taos Hum becomes less a single event and more a perceptual boundary condition, an interaction between environment, physiology, and attention. However, even this explanation leaves unanswered questions. Why do only some individuals perceive it so clearly, while others in the same space do not? Why does its presence appear stable over time for certain listeners, yet entirely absent for others? And why do similar reports of low-frequency hums appear in different parts of the world, often with comparable descriptions despite geographic separation? These questions have led to more exploratory interpretations. Some researchers have examined the role of auditory processing sensitivity, suggesting that variations in human hearing systems may cause certain individuals to detect environmental frequencies that remain unnoticed by others. This could include subtle vibrations transmitted through bone conduction or resonance within enclosed spaces. Others have proposed that cognitive factors may play a role, not in the sense of imagination, but in how the brain interprets ambiguous sensory input. In quiet environments, the auditory system can become highly sensitive, sometimes amplifying internal or external noise into a perceived external sound. There are also more speculative environmental theories. Some suggest that the Earth itself may produce localized electromagnetic or geophysical emissions that interact with human perception in ways not yet fully understood. In this interpretation, the hum could represent a byproduct of complex planetary processes that are not fully captured by conventional acoustic measurement tools. Other ideas extend further into the unknown, proposing that certain modern environments, particularly those with extensive infrastructure, communication systems, and underground networks, may create overlapping vibrational fields that produce low-level resonance effects in specific geographic conditions. Yet none of these theories fully resolve the phenomenon as experienced. What remains consistent across accounts is not the source, but the description. A low, persistent presence, difficult to locate, impossible to fully isolate, and experienced only by some. It does not behave like a typical sound source. It does not appear consistently in recordings. It does not point clearly toward a single origin. And so, in Taos, the hum exists in a kind of observational limbo. It is reported, yet not universally confirmed. Experienced, yet not reliably measured. Described with consistency, yet without a definitive cause. Over time, it has become part of the region's modern identity, not as folklore in the traditional sense, but as a documented ambiguity that resists closure. For some, it is an annoyance. For others, a curiosity. For a small number, it is a persistent companion to silence itself. And perhaps the most enduring question it leaves behind is not whether the sound exists in absolute terms, but what it reveals about perception when the boundary between external environment and internal interpretation becomes difficult to define, and whether the silence of Taos is truly silent at all, or simply a place where only certain listeners are able to hear what the rest of the world filters out without ever noticing. From the quiet persistence of the Taos Hum, where perception itself becomes uncertain and silence is no longer universally shared, the narrative now moves further into the landscape of modern mysteries shaped not by sound alone, but by sight, memory, and the fragile reliability of human observation. This time, the phenomenon does not linger in the background like an unseen frequency. Instead, it arrives in brief, unsettling flashes, moments where ordinary life seems to fracture into something slightly misaligned, as if reality itself briefly shifts out of phase before returning to normal. It is here that another category of unexplained reports begins to surface, one that does not belong to a single place, but to a pattern of human experience recorded across decades and continents. These are not always dramatic events. They are often subtle. A figure glimpsed where no one should be standing. A street that seems unfamiliar despite being well known. A moment of disorientation that fades too quickly to verify. In many accounts, witnesses describe a sensation of wrongness, not fear in the traditional sense, but a quiet recognition that something in the environment does not align with expectation. A hallway that feels slightly longer than remembered. A reflection that appears delayed. A voice heard from a direction that does not match its source. Unlike physical mysteries tied to a single location or object, these experiences resist documentation. They cannot be captured consistently on camera. They do not produce physical traces. Yet they are reported often enough to form a recognizable pattern in modern anomalous studies. Some researchers refer to these experiences as perceptual anomalies, moments where sensory input and cognitive interpretation fail to synchronize in predictable ways. Under this framework, the brain is not simply recording reality, but actively constructing it from incomplete data. When that construction becomes unstable, due to fatigue, lighting conditions, environmental complexity, or neurological variation, the result may be experiences that feel externally real, even when they arise from internal processing. In this interpretation, the mystery is not in the environment itself, but in the interface between perception and reality. Still, not all explanations remain within neurological boundaries. There are accounts that describe synchronized anomalies, multiple individuals reporting similar distortions in the same environment at the same time. These cases challenge purely internal explanations, suggesting that under certain conditions, shared environmental factors may influence perception in ways that are not yet fully understood. Researchers exploring these patterns have examined variables such as electromagnetic fluctuations, infrasound interactions, and complex lighting conditions in urban environments. Each of these factors can subtly alter human perception, particularly in low visibility or high stimulation settings. Yet no single factor has been identified that consistently produces the reported experiences across all cases. This lack of consistency leaves room for broader interpretation. Some perspectives suggest that modern environments, dense with signals, reflections, artificial lighting, and constant sensory input, may create conditions where perception becomes more easily destabilized. In this view, what is experienced as anomaly is not an external disruption, but an internal adjustment process responding to overwhelming environmental complexity. Others propose that memory itself plays a role. Human recollection is not static, it is reconstructive. When recalling familiar spaces, the mind fills gaps with expectation. Under certain conditions, this reconstruction may diverge slightly from present reality, creating a momentary sense of misalignment between what is seen and what is expected. And yet, even within these frameworks, there remain reports that resist simple categorization. Some describe structured patterns, repeating sequences of perceived anomalies in specific locations. Others report shared experiences among multiple witnesses that include consistent descriptions of unusual visual or spatial distortions. These accounts, while rare, continue to appear in contemporary discussions of unexplained perception. What makes these experiences particularly compelling is their lack of physical residue. Unlike mechanical failures or environmental phenomena, they leave no lasting trace, no object to examine, no signal to measure. Only testimony, memory, and the lingering uncertainty of whether what was experienced was external, internal, or something that exists at the boundary between the two. In this sense, the mystery does not point outward toward a single unexplained object or event. Instead, it turns inward toward the mechanisms of perception itself, how the brain constructs continuity, how it resolves ambiguity, and how it responds when that resolution briefly fails. And so the question remains open, not anchored to a place or a signal or a sound, but to the act of experiencing reality itself. When perception deviates from expectation in ways that feel undeniably real, where does the explanation truly belong? And how often might such moments pass unnoticed simply because they resolve too quickly to be questioned at all? From the fragile edge of perception, where reality seems to shift just enough to be questioned, the narrative now moves away from modern sensory ambiguity and returns to a place shaped by isolation, weather, and the relentless authority of the sea. Here, mystery does not emerge from within the mind or from unseen frequencies in the air. It unfolds in silence, salt wind, and the absence of human presence where human presence was expected to remain constant. The setting is the Flannan Isles, a small and remote group of islands off the western coast of Scotland. Jagged rock formations rise from the Atlantic Ocean, battered continuously by wind and waves. There are no settlements here, no natural shelter from storms, and no easy access from the mainland. It is a landscape defined by distance, distance from civilization, distance from communication, and sometimes distance from explanation itself. On the largest of these islands stands Eilean Moor, home to a lighthouse constructed in the late 19th century to guide ships through some of the most dangerous waters in the North Atlantic. The structure was built to withstand harsh conditions, its purpose simple but essential: to cast light into darkness where navigation becomes uncertain and the sea offers no forgiveness for error. By December 1900, the lighthouse was operational and staffed by 3 keepers: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Their duty was routine but demanding, maintaining the light, monitoring weather conditions, and ensuring the safety of passing vessels. Life at such stations was known for isolation, but also for structure. Shifts were scheduled, logs were maintained, communication with the mainland occurred periodically. And then, something changed. When the relief vessel arrived on December 26, 1900, the lighthouse was found in a state that immediately raised concern. There were no signs of the keepers. The light had gone out, which in itself was unusual, as lighthouse protocol emphasized continuous operation under all conditions. Inside the station, Conditions appeared disordered in subtle but unsettling ways: an overturned chair, an unmade bed, and signs that daily routines had been interrupted abruptly. But there were no clear indicators of struggle, no definitive evidence of what had occurred, no physical traces that could immediately explain the absence of all three men. The official logbook, later recovered, provided a fragmentary account of the days leading up to the discovery. Entries described severe weather conditions, particularly strong storms sweeping across the islands. One entry mentioned the absence of one of the keepers from the station, despite no clear explanation for his departure. Another referenced growing concern about equipment and environmental conditions. The final entries became increasingly cryptic in tone, noting unusual atmospheric conditions and heightened concern among the keepers. Then, the record ends. What followed was an investigation that sought to reconstruct the final days at Eilean Moor. Maritime authorities considered multiple possibilities. One of the most widely accepted explanations suggests that a severe storm may have swept across the islands, creating conditions dangerous enough that one or more of the keepers may have left the lighthouse structure to secure equipment or investigate damage. In this scenario, it is possible that an accident occurred near the cliffs or rocky shoreline, with the remaining keepers following in search of their colleague, resulting in a tragic sequence of events. The strength of Atlantic storms in this region is well documented. Waves can rise rapidly, winds can exceed safe limits, and visibility can drop to near zero within moments. Under such conditions, even experienced lighthouse keepers could find themselves vulnerable to sudden environmental shifts. Yet this explanation, while plausible, does not fully resolve every detail. No bodies were recovered. No definitive physical evidence was found outside the lighthouse that conclusively explained the disappearance. The absence of clear trace evidence left space for uncertainty to persist. Other interpretations have emerged over time. Some suggest that psychological factors may have played a role. Extended isolation in remote environments can produce stress responses, heightened sensitivity, and altered perception. In such conditions, ordinary environmental sounds or visual cues might be interpreted in ways that lead to unexpected decisions or disorientation. Others have considered the possibility of a rare natural phenomenon, perhaps an unusually powerful wave event, or a combination of wind and sea conditions that created circumstances beyond typical maritime experience. Rogue waves, for example, are known to occur in the North Atlantic and can exert forces strong enough to remove structures or individuals from exposed areas. Still, no single environmental model has been able to reconstruct the events with certainty. More speculative interpretations have also circulated, often focusing on the limitations of historical record-keeping and the incomplete nature of observational data from isolated sites in the early 20th century. These perspectives emphasize that what remains is not a full account of events, but a partial record filtered through human perception, environmental constraints, and the silence that follows disappearance. There are even broader philosophical interpretations that treat the Eilean Moor incident not as a puzzle to be solved, but as an example of how certain environments resist complete narrative reconstruction. In this view, the lighthouse becomes a boundary point between human order and natural unpredictability, between documented routine and undocumented interruption. What remains consistent across all interpretations is absence. Absence of the keepers, absence of definitive evidence, absence of a final, confirmable sequence of events. And so Eilean Moor remains suspended in maritime history as a place where routine ended without explanation, where structured duty met sudden silence, and where the sea reclaimed its own narrative without leaving behind a clear account of what transpired on those final days of 1900. And perhaps the question that continues to linger is not only what happened within the lighthouse, but what it reveals about the limits of reconstruction itself, when human systems of record, observation, and logic encounter environments powerful enough to erase continuity, leaving only fragments behind, and asking whether some events are lost, not because they were never understood, but because they occurred in conditions where understanding itself could not remain intact long enough to be preserved. From the silent void of Eilean Moor, where routine ended without witness and the Atlantic reclaimed every certainty, the narrative now moves outward once more, leaving behind the edge of storm and stone. This time, the focus shifts from isolated geography to a mystery that does not belong to any fixed location on Earth, yet has been repeatedly reported across time, cultures, and observation systems designed specifically to detect the unknown. It does not appear as a structure. It does not move through landscapes. It does not leave physical traces in the conventional sense. Instead, it arrives as a signal, a pattern of radio emission that, for a brief moment in astronomical history, appeared to suggest something deliberate, something structured, emerging from deep space. This is known as the WOW signal. The event occurred on August 15, 1977, during a routine scan of the sky conducted by the Big Ear Radio Telescope at Ohio State University, part of a long-term project dedicated to the search for extraterrestrial radio transmissions. The telescope was not looking for anomalies in particular. It was surveying vast sections of the sky, recording radio frequencies in the hope that, somewhere within the noise of the cosmos, a pattern might emerge that did not originate from natural astrophysical processes. On that night, something did. For 72 seconds, a strong narrow-band radio signal was detected coming from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. The signal was so distinct within its frequency range that when astronomer Jerry Amon later reviewed the printout of the data, he circled the sequence and wrote a single word in the margin: "Wow." That handwritten note would become the name by which the event is still known. The signal's characteristics immediately drew attention within the scientific community. It appeared at approximately 1,420 megahertz, a frequency closely associated with the natural emission of hydrogen, the most abundant element in the universe. Because hydrogen's spectral line is considered a quiet channel in radio astronomy, it is often monitored as a potential band for interstellar communication. The detection of a strong, narrow-band signal at this frequency was therefore unusual. Even more intriguing was its structure. The signal did not resemble typical cosmic noise or known natural sources such as pulsars, quasars, or background radiation fluctuations. It appeared concentrated, stable within its brief duration, and distinct from surrounding interference. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. Despite repeated attempts, the signal was never detected again. No confirmed repetition, no identical pattern, no identifiable source. The transient nature of the event immediately raised questions that remain unresolved. One of the primary challenges in interpreting the WOW signal lies in its singularity. In radio astronomy, repeatability is essential for verification. A signal must be observed multiple times, from multiple instruments or at multiple intervals, to establish a reliable source. The WOW signal, by contrast, appeared only once, for a short window of time, and never returned in a confirmed form. This has led to a range of possible explanations. One of the most widely discussed interpretations is that the signal may have originated from a natural astrophysical source that has not yet been fully identified. While most known cosmic phenomena produce broadband emissions or predictable patterns, there remains the possibility that rare or transient events could generate narrowband signals under specific conditions not yet fully understood. However, no known natural mechanism has fully matched the precise characteristics of the signal as recorded. Another possibility involves terrestrial interference. Radio frequency noise from Earth-based sources, satellites, aircraft, or ground transmissions, can sometimes reflect off atmospheric layers or appear in unexpected regions of the sky. Yet careful analysis of the data at the time did not conclusively support a local origin, and no matching signal source was identified within known terrestrial systems operating on that frequency. This absence of confirmation left space for alternative interpretations. Some researchers have considered the possibility of an unintentional signal from an unknown human source, perhaps experimental or transient in nature, not documented in existing records. In this view, the signal could represent a brief technological emission that was never repeated or properly logged. Yet extensive searches through historical records have not revealed any corresponding transmission systems capable of producing the observed pattern. Beyond conventional explanations, the WOW signal has also become a focal point in discussions of interstellar communication. The frequency at which it was detected lies within a scientifically significant range, and its narrowband structure resembles what some theoretical models suggest would be optimal for artificial signaling across vast cosmic distances. However, no additional signals from the same region of space have ever been confirmed, and no accompanying data has been found to suggest a structured message or repeating pattern. What remains is a single detection, isolated, unverified, and unmatched. In scientific terms, it exists as an anomaly without repetition. In observational terms, it is a moment that cannot be reconstructed. In historical terms, it is a record entry that points to something brief and distant, yet never fully defined. Over the decades, increasingly sensitive radio surveys have scanned the same region of the sky where the signal was first detected. Nothing identical has been found. The silence that followed has remained consistent, deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. And so the WOW signal occupies a unique position in the study of the unknown, not as a confirmed message, not as a dismissed error, but as a single, unrepeatable event that briefly stood out from the cosmic background before disappearing without explanation. It leaves behind no structure to examine, no source to revisit, only a question embedded in the data itself. And perhaps the most enduring uncertainty is not simply what produced the signal, but what it means when the universe appears, even for a moment, to speak in a form that cannot be replicated, confirmed, or heard again, and whether that brief silence that followed was the absence of meaning, or simply the absence of a second chance to listen.